Good afternoon and welcome. Nice to see everybody after a hiatus over the summer from these monthly meetings anyway, and nice to see all of you since the retreat. I want to extend a warm welcome to Carolyn Kane, who's here from the Office of Health and Human Services. She currently serves as the executive director of the Autism Commission and has taken Patty Mackin's role. So great thanks to Patty for her service to us, and a warm welcome to you, Carolyn. By way of sort of brief context setting for today, we're going to jump in to the agenda with items that carry forward from previous meetings. We're going to sort of think back to the winter when we had a discussion of these subsidy regulations, and they've since been revised and undergone a number of discussions, and we have both a red line version and a clean version that you'll see, and we will hear from Felicia Sullivan, Tom Meyers, and Carol Meehan there. On the more policy initiative side, we're going to revisit the QRIS and look to bring that to closure in the next month or so. We will also do the same for the subsidy regs. They will both items will be on the agenda again in October for a vote. So today is really a chance to have a discussion before a vote to advise the agency on any with any feedback and thoughts, and go from there. The QRIS, we met last week as a workforce committee and looked at a version quite similar to the one we have before us today, just a few changes that Amy and Anita will walk us through. But today's really a chance to revisit the QRIS big picture and in terms of content and the strategy around the theory of change for quality improvement. But we're also, as we discussed at the retreat, at a real inflection point. It's a big upcoming year. There is a lot of momentum. There are a lot of initiatives with funding behind them, and I know that that will be part of the commissioner's update. On the board side, I will thank Dave Cruz for agreeing to chair fiscal and oversight, and that work will resume this month and include, as we discussed at the retreat, a focus on the transportation work among regular business items. So I think I will stop there. Comments from the secretary before I turn it to the commissioner?
Nothing from me, Madam Chair.
That is so surprising.
I know.
All right, Commissioner.
I'm very glad he did that.
Go ahead.
Also not surprising, I do have comments. Thank you very much, Chairperson. Thank you, members of the board, members of the public, for being here. Welcome, Carolyn, to the board. Please let us know if there's anything we can do to be of assistance to you as you're integrating yourself into this work. I want to start by acknowledging the astonishing level of effort that our staff has been putting in over the course of this summer. And without diminishing the extraordinary efforts of so many on so many fronts, I want to note in particular the efforts that were undertaken to support the rollout of the LEAD system, which is our new automated system for licensing, which launched at the end of July and has been successfully operating over the last 2 months, and is already yielding, I think, really extraordinarily positive results, and will continue to provide us with, I think, a really powerful tool in assessing our licensing work, not only to make sure that people are in compliance, but also to inform our policy and practice here at the agency. And that's been an extraordinary effort over the last 2 years in developing that system in partnership with EOE IT. And I'm very grateful to the staff for having undertaken that and lifted that off the ground. I also want to point to an extraordinary amount of work that's been taking place in service of making sure that we're in compliance with the Child Care Development Block Grant, many features of which are required to be compliant by the end of this month. And in particular, I wanted to cite the work that's been going on with the background record check system. The IT system to support background record checks is now online to be delivered at the very beginning of 2019. So as a result of that, we've been working with our existing IT system, and we're beginning to gradually roll out features of compliance with background record check requirements under federal law, starting with the mandatory disqualifications, which we communicated to the field last week. There's a lot of ongoing intensive activity to support the development of the system, as well as system testing, communication and training, as well as the policy and processes that are required under the new background record check requirements. All of this activity is being supported in conjunction with a lot of support from the governor's office and EOE, and I'm grateful for that. and a lot of work undertaken here at EEC, and I wanted to just applaud folks for those efforts. There are other areas of compliance for CCDBG as well, and I wanted to note that we did submit the state plan at the end of August, as was required, that we are either in complete or substantial compliance in almost all areas, and that we have plans in place and are undertaking planning in those areas that still remain for us to undertake effort. We are confident that we'll be in compliance by the time that we are monitored by the federal government, which at this point is scheduled for late April of 2019. But as I noted, in most areas, we already have met our compliance requirements, and we're in, I think, good standing. And as we assess state plans across the nation, I think we are at least consistent, if not ahead, in many of the areas of compliance. So this will remain an ongoing feature of my updates throughout the course of this year, as this work is likely to continue across the full FY19 calendar. So I expect this will be an ongoing part of my report month to month, and there will be other formal presentations made to the board and to board subcommittees throughout the course of this year. I want to also take a note to recognize the 2 agenda items that are on for today. These are exciting items in and of themselves, but I also think that they appropriately represent sort of the goalposts for this agency in many respects and important respects this year. One important goalpost is what I just noted, fulfilling the federal child care development block grant requirements. And a second one is advancing our program and workforce quality agenda. And as evidenced today through our consideration of the interim subsidy policies and the proposed subsidy regulations, as well as the QRIS standards in our planned vote next month, we intend to move on both fronts. But I want to note that fundamental to the success of achieving those goals is that we seize every opportunity to integrate the 2 objectives, that we not see it as a exercise of compliance on one hand and a program quality and workforce quality on the other, but that we, as an agency, in working with our governance structure here at the board, continue to look at ways that we are ensuring for the full integration of those activities so that we're building systems of support and building an agency that is sustainable and successful in helping the field meet its objectives of delivering high quality early education and care to our youngest learners. I look forward to working with the chair and as well as the rest of the board this year in translating all the opportunities that we see in front of us to successful outcomes on behalf of the department's mission. In service of, or perhaps even in creating an opportunity, EEC and EOE recently issued an RFR to support our analysis and execution of the child care development block grant requirements and assess related key business processes and provide recommendations regarding agency and system capacity and design. As that work unfolds, I look forward to sharing the progress and recommendations of that work with this group, and I anticipate that this work naturally will inform the opportunity represented by the new CCDBG funding. So I see obviously a close nexus between those activities and the opportunities of investing further in support of our compliance activities as well as our workforce and quality agendas. Again, I look forward to continuing to work on those matters with the chair and this board. I wanted to provide 3 audit-related updates to the board, each of which is preliminary. The first is that KPMG, as part of what's known as the single state audit of all federal funding, was on site this summer. This is a fairly regular event. It was actually an anomaly that we weren't part of the single state audit last year, but we generally are. We expect those findings to be released shortly, and I'll provide those findings to the board either through the fiscal committee or to the full board, and I can speak with the chair about the best way to direct those, but I wanted to make sure that you are aware of the existence of that audit. The second update relates to the Health and Human Services Office of Inspector General audit that I presented on along with Felicia Sullivan last year to this board. As you might recall, they had audited the Title IV-E funding that comes to the state. As part of the audit findings, in particular, there was findings of, with respect to the BRC processes that EEC oversees for some of the Title IV-E recipients. We met recently with the Administration of Children and Families to review our response to those audit findings. We had a very favorable conversation with ACF upon review. That's not the formal conclusion. We do expect that the OIG will formally wrap up that audit and will provide additional information, but I wanted to provide you with an interim update based on the conversation that we'd had with ACF. And finally, I wanted to note that we will be receiving an audit from the State Auditor's Office that will be initiated starting next week. This is an audit of EEC's oversight of residential and placement programs. The entrance meeting is scheduled for early next week, and I'll continue to share information with the board as appropriate and necessary. Finally, I want to note 2 new spending plan areas that we intend to feature at this Friday's Board Workforce Committee. The first is the Workforce Council funding. That's $10 million of new funding that EEC sees as a prime opportunity to build on the Massachusetts professional development system as described in the Massachusetts Strong Start Vision paper that we've been discussing with the board over the course of really a half year now. And the second opportunity is the Commonwealth Preschool Partnership, which is $5 million of new funding in the state budget that EEC sees as an excellent opportunity to build on the lessons learned under the federal preschool expansion grant model. And we're going to look at that funding to see how we might be able to create a sustainable and potentially scalable model with those funds. Both of those items are being tracked to the Workforce Committee for this Friday, in addition to any outcomes from the QRIS conversation that the board has today. So in conclusion, I just want to note that all the items that I just mentioned alone represent substantial opportunities, but also represent a substantial amount of work. And they do not begin to account for all the priorities of this agency or the day-to-day responsibilities of this agency. So as we begin the new year, and I know for some in the room, this is formally the new year, so happy Rosh Hashanah to you. I want to reiterate my comment and commitment, to work closely with this board and our partners both inside and outside the agency so that we're making careful consideration of the issues and we're seizing every opportunity that we have to take care of our compliance responsibilities and further our quality agenda in ways that are sustainable and ultimately support the mission of this agency in service of children and families. So that concludes my report. Thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you. So we will shift now to statements from the public. I noticed we've got about 9 folks signed up. We will aim for 3 minutes, and I will suggest that I call the speaker and name the person on deck, starting with Lucas Skorskeski from the Acre Family Childcare on the topic of transportation, Kim Dion from the CCR&R network on deck. Thank you. Welcome.
I timed myself for 3 minutes. Secretary Pizer, Commissioner Weber, Chairwoman Lasso, members of the EEC board. Transportation is a key service that for many families makes the difference in whether a child makes it to care or not. While the field has bemoaned the complexity and cost of this system, I'm compelled to report from the field that drastically cutting and eliminating transportation services will have an immediate negative consequence for some of the most at-risk children and families in the state, as well as the workforce. To respond to the recently distributed Transportation Survey Number 2 assessment report, there's one part in particular I found especially troubling. It was that for providers that eliminated transportation, we have no idea where children who exited the program are now, or if they're even in care. This makes for a terrifying backdrop against the multiple cost assessments that outline significant reductions in service levels. To understand the impact that transportation has for the non-priority population families we work with, we conducted a quick survey. Approximately 51% of the children we work with in basic contracts and 67% of the children we work with in voucher contracts utilize our transportation services. We were able to speak to close to half of these parents to gather their feedback. 98% of these families in basic contracts and 100% in voucher contracts stated that losing transportation would make their life more difficult. 14% of these families in basic contracts and 0% in voucher contracts reported that they would be able to stay with their current child care program if transportation was eliminated. 98% of these families in basic contracts and 100% in voucher contracts reported that not having transportation would impact their work or school schedule. In fact, many parents did not answer these questions with a simple yes or no. They answered with comments like, quote, "If I didn't have transportation, I would be homeless right now," and quote, "To pick up my child, I'd have to leave work early and I could potentially lose my job, end quote. To be clear, none of these families would be considered priority population. Many have cars of their own, and the majority do not have a documented disability of any sort. In other words, these are the families in the report being scrutinized for receiving transportation services. I would also like to recall the first transportation study, which found that for programs that provided transportation, quote, 77% of providers say that if they did not provide subsidized transportation, they would have trouble filling their current level of capacity, and quote, 84% indicate that families would not be served by any child care program, end quote. This sentiment, or any sentiment that conveyed the importance of transportation for families, was absent in the second survey. I'd also like to address the recommendation to discontinue the use of independent contractors. As an agency that works with both full-time bus drivers and utilizes independent contractors, both groups have the same standards as it relates to quality, safety, and job performance. In fact, like the family child care providers we're working with, these subcontracted drivers are creating small businesses within our community and creating new jobs by filling an unmet need which benefits families. To conclude, any categorical or significant reduction in transportation for children receiving subsidized care will have a direct and immediate negative impact on families, children, and the workforce. Where the transportation study suggests building partnerships between educators and public school systems, I would implore you to build partnerships between EEC and early childhood agencies. The conversation around encouraging children to attend care in a safe and reliable manner is a conversation I believe every system and every educator would be willing to have. Thank you very much.
Kim Dion from the CCR&R network with Titus Dos Remedios from Strategies on deck.
Good afternoon. My name's Kim Dion, and I'm representing the Massachusetts Child Care Resource and Referral Network. We're looking forward to the upcoming trainings about new subsidy regulations and stand ready to work with and assist EEC staff in any way that we can. I really want to thank you all for your support in securing an additional $2 million in the access management line item. We are most appreciative of the increase and look forward to putting the new dollars to work for us. So thank you to the board members and Commissioner Weber and your staff, most particularly Bill Concannon, for your ongoing support of our programs. Thank you.
Titus Dos Remedios from Strategies for Children with Kimberly Rigo and Nicole Kayer on deck from the LP College Incorporated.
Good afternoon, Board Chair Lasso and members of the board, Secretary Pizer and Commissioner Weber. Thank you for this opportunity. My name is Titus Dos Remedios, and I'm Director of Research and Policy at Strategies for Children. Heading into another school year, we are encouraged by the recent progress and momentum for high-quality early education and care. The federal budget passed last spring doubled funding for the Child Care and Development Block Grant, an increase that allows states to serve 230,000 more children, including several thousand more here in Massachusetts. We are eager to see the state's plan for allocating these new child care funds. A new federal grant, the Birth to 5 Preschool Development Grant, is an opportunity for statewide planning, needs assessments, and collaboration with our public health partners. We hope Massachusetts will apply by the November 6th due date. The state budget in FY19 is the best in 10 years for early education and the first to surpass the pre-recession high point in FY09 of state funding for this agency. The state budget includes, as Commissioner Weber referenced earlier, a $10 million fund for a new workforce development initiative aligned with EEC's ongoing professional development plans and engaging local community colleges, and also a workforce rate increase of $20 million. This is the 5th consecutive year that the legislature has funded rates, allowing subsidized programs to give their teachers a well-deserved raise. Strategies for Children's top priority is preschool expansion. Since FY16, EEC has awarded preschool expansion planning grants to 18 communities that have written now customized local plans. This year, state leaders have taken a first step toward implementation. The final FY19 budget includes $5 million for implementation grants that Commissioner Weber referenced earlier. Communities are excited about this funding and busy revisiting their plans. To connect these communities to one another, Strategies for Children hosted 2 planning calls in August. 22 individuals participated, representing most of the 18 planning communities. Key themes emerged from our discussion: questions about timing, allowable use of funds, long-term sustainability, and options for blending and braiding funding sources. The need for more high-quality preschool is substantial. Roughly 800 4-year-olds per year are served by the federally funded PEG program. However, we estimate that close to 10,000 children in high-needs communities do not attend preschool due to cost or space factors. These children could enroll in the state's mixed delivery system of early education and care if new public funds became available. We ask EEC to release the new preschool implementation funding as soon as possible, releasing an RFR no later than November 1st so that communities have time to apply, receive, and successfully implement programming by the end of the fiscal year. Finally, we look forward to working with you in the legislature on a comprehensive long-term preschool plan. The first step is sustaining the successful PEG program. Federal funds expire next summer, and PEG, all 48 classrooms, will end unless we take collective action to save it. The clock is ticking. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Did you want to respond?
Thank you for your testimony, Titus. I was just going to note, it is our goal to post the RFR prior to November 1st. That's actually part of the motivation for our bringing it to the Workforce Committee this coming Friday, is to keep it on a timeline that would allow us to get it out early this fall so that we can try to support activity with those grants by the middle of this fiscal year. So, thanks.
So Kimberly Regal and Nicole Kayer from LP College Incorporated on transportation, with William Eddy on deck from MADCA.
Hi, I came from the Greater New Bedford area, where LP College, or Little People's College, and after reading the study, I just thought that it might be beneficial, hopefully, that I come and spoke to you as a company that's been providing transportation for over 20 years to the community and employs hundreds of people from the community. Our families do really, really rely on the transportation system, and I think that it would be detrimental if we didn't have it. It also lends to our quality of care that we have our own transportation system. We train our own drivers monthly, and they're able to communicate with our families who aren't able to come to the centers every day, so they know, how to relay messages back and forth. We have been audited twice by EEC very, very recently, our transportation department, and we passed with flying colors. I am part of the administration team there, but primarily I'm the CFO. So after reading the study, I thought that it would be beneficial if I came here and I spoke to you as someone who does provide transportation in an area that's relevant. New Bedford's a gateway city. We're not Vermont. We really do pay attention to what we do with transportation and what it costs us. We provide 1,500 rides per day back and forth. We have 1,000 families, 700 of which utilize the transportation, and that's just ourselves. We also have a sister company. That's why we're LP College Inc. and we have Little People's College. And in closing, I wanted to thank you because I'm now working there, but 20 years ago I was a single parent with 2 young children, didn't have a car, and I did use the transportation. I wasn't a priority population parent, and I don't know if I would have gotten through as successfully as I did had I not had the transportation. So thank you for that. And I brought a parent rep who has been with us for a long time and relies on it, and is a little success story that I thought maybe she could speak to you about transportation and how it's helped her.
Thank you. Excuse me, I'm a little nervous to talk. My name's Nicole, and my son has been with Little People's for 8 years. He's 10 years old now. When he first started attending, I had just gone back to work. I was an EMS at the time. When he was about 5, I decided that I needed to advance my career, so I decided to go back to college to pursue my nursing degree. So my schedule was a little grueling. I'm a single parent. I was working full-time. I had a full-time schedule with classes, and I also had clinicals. So a lot of my mornings started off really early prior to the time he was going to be going to school. So I really utilized the transportation to get him to school from Little People's College so I could excel in my education and my career. At this time, I have 2 associate's degrees. I have an associate's degree in health sciences, and I also just obtained my degree as a registered nurse. And I feel that if I didn't have the opportunity to send my son to Little People's and utilize the transportation system so he could get to school, that I would not have been able to better our lives in the manner that I did. I didn't have a lot of opportunities to speak with his teachers because I had a really growing schedule. So when I picked him up, I was able to speak with the staff at Little People's and speak with the bus driver about how my son's day went. So it really kept me like in contact with how my son was doing, and I really feel like the transportation is important in order to advance our lives. I feel like I'm about to not need assistance with the transportation anymore because my schedule will be changing. But I feel like if the transportation services are taken away, it is going to take away from opportunities for other people that were in my situation previously to excel in their lives as well. So that's it. Thank you. Thank you.
William Eddy from Madca with Brittany Edelman from the YMCA's on deck.
Good afternoon. Nice to see you all. I hope you all had a great summer. Just a quick word about, I'm William Eddy. I'm the Executive Director of the Massachusetts Association of Early Education and Care. We're the trade group that represents the majority of the providers who provide services for you folks. And I want to say a quick word about QRIS before I get to the main topic of transportation. A number of years ago, Madam Chair, we met with you to talk about the need to streamline and make QRIS more effective. And we've had many conversations with the Commissioner on similar conversations. And so I'd be remiss if I didn't thank you today for the progress that you have made and will roll out here today, and the work that Anita and her team have done. And we look forward to working with you in the coming years to hopefully get an IT system that can support it and make this a true measurement of quality in the Commonwealth. So that said, I wanted to say a word about transportation. It's our first chance to come see you on this topic since you received the report in the summer. And it's a report that frankly was disappointing to us. Multiple misstatement of facts in the report, the use of anonymous quotes to question whether transportation took away from quality, whether transportation had any impact on attendance, a comparison to a state of Vermont which is smaller than Boston and who demographically looks nothing like our system. Frankly, we thought the report was embarrassing for the agency and did a disservice to the board in terms of information. I get the department's frustration with the transportation system. I'm sure there are superintendents of school who've been as frustrated with transportation as the agency is. The difference is the superintendents have been funded for it, and you folks haven't, to sufficiently run early education transportation. But I would suggest to you that the alternative of contracting transportation is not the route to go. It does a disservice and isn't really feasible for DCF children who are in the system. And frankly, I think it's a disservice to parents and a disservice to the providers who have put together a transportation system under EEC to try and service our low-income working families. What I would urge you to do, I would urge you to look at what it is that EEC needs to staff it up and what is a reasonable first step for funding to make it safer and to also fund what it costs. And to simply, as a board, make a proactive statement and ask for a supplemental budget from the legislature to fund it. I don't see what your other alternative is. Walking away from it, frankly, doesn't accomplish what you folks choose to do each meeting and each day to try and provide the best quality of service for children and families. So we look forward to working with you. We urge you to look at what is the real cost, because frankly, the $200 million figure in the report has the credibility of the entire report, which to us means very little. So we look forward to working with you to develop what is a real figure, and we look forward to working with you to building up a transportation system that we can all be proud of. Thank you.
Brittany Edelman from the YMCA's with Rob ODwyer on deck. Okay.
Madam Chairwoman, Secretary Pizer, Commissioner Weber, and members of the board. Thank you for the opportunity to speak in front of you today, and thank you for your tireless efforts to improve the quality rating improvement system to best serve the children across the Commonwealth. My name is Brittany Edelman, and I am the Healthy Initiatives Manager at the Alliance of Massachusetts YMCAs. As many of you know, the Alliance is a membership organization for the 30 Y associations in Massachusetts and represents over 700 service locations across the state. Massachusetts YMCAs are one of the largest providers of early education and out-of-school time care in the Commonwealth, and we currently serve 500,000 youth under the age of 18. The Massachusetts Ys are highly concerned with providing the youth we serve with the highest quality early education and after-school time programs that we can. With that being said, it is crucial that nutrition and physical activity is incorporated into the QRIS starting at a level 4. These standards would require updated nutrition requirements with an emphasis on healthy meals, snacks, and beverages, as well as a physical activity component to ensure that children are receiving adequate levels of moderate to vigorous physical activity. We also plan to continue our work with EEC staff to research tools and online training modules to provide educators with the continuing ed opportunities necessary to adopt a focus on health and wellness in their respective classrooms. As you all are aware, child obesity rates are a harsh reality afflicting many of the children and families EEC serves every day. Nearly 1 in 3 children in Massachusetts are overweight or obese. And the early years of childhood, from birth to age 5, are a critical period for the development of these healthy behaviors that can have a lifelong impact on children's quality of life, which continue into adulthood. As you continue your work to finalize the newly modified QRIS, we ask that you take these recommendations into consideration to adopt refined standards of healthy eating and physical activity into the QRIS at a level 4. Thank you very much for your time today.
Madam Chairwoman, Secretary Pizer, Commissioner Weber, and members of the board, thank you for the opportunity to speak in front of you today, and thank you for your continued efforts to improve the quality of after-school and early education programs in the Commonwealth. My name is Rob ODwyer. I'm here as a parent to urge the board to consider health and wellness standards for the QRIS. As a parent of 3, 5, 7, and 10, early education and after-school programs are essential to the day-to-day workings for my family. It's important that after-school programs not only provide my kids with skills that will help them in school, but also for them to be healthy and active. Families like mine are increasingly relying on out-of-school time programs to provide a safe place for our children to learn and grow. After-school programs have also now become a promising avenue to help improve health and wellness of students, from providing healthy foods to keeping students active and physically fit. The standards would require updated nutrition requirements, an emphasis on healthy meals, snacks, and beverages, as well as physical activity component to ensure that children are receiving adequate levels of physical activity. This would allow my kids and others to reap the benefits of optimal nutrition and physical activity, while parents like me and my wife and others are working to support our families. As you continue your work to finalize the newly modified QRIS, I ask that you take these recommendations into consideration to adopt refined standards of healthy eating and physical activity into the QRIS at a level 4. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So that concludes our public comment. We don't have any routine, oh, I'm sorry. Of course. Maybe there's a second sheet that I don't have. I'm sorry.
What's your name? My name's Crystal Arsenal from the Guild of St. Agnes.
Okay, come right up. I'm sorry about that.
We'll be short.
We're just here to kind of share a little of the insight of what it would be without transportation. Our very first bus route is actually children that have parents in high school, and they can't physically walk their children to school before they have to walk themselves to school. Providers aren't open. So we're able to pick them up, and their children are getting to school the same time they're getting to school. We work with a lot of DCF families. We know they're involved for multiple reasons. Some of them are not working and they're at home, and there's a reason those children aren't home with them. And that simply worries me if there was no transportation to give them, their parents, that mental break they need. And then there's the workforce parents, and that's where we have Danielle, and she wants to share a little bit with you.
As she stated, I'm Danielle. I'm a young mom of 5 beautiful children. My children are currently enrolled in daycare and they use the transportation system. I do have a husband, but we are not able to have a car at the moment. My children rely on the transportation system to get to and from daycare so that we can do what we need to do during the day to work and provide for them. If we lose the transportation, I can't work, which means I was a stay-at-home mom. I just recently got back to work. I'm really proud of myself. I want to accomplish things. And if I don't have the transportation, I can't get them to and from, which means not only do they lose the relationship with the providers that they get outside of the home, but they don't get to learn and grow and socialize because they won't be able to take a part in those types of services. That transportation is my only support system. I don't have family. I don't have friends. I dropped all my friends for my kids. So I don't have friends or family who can watch them or help with rides and such. So this transportation service helps them to get to and from so that they can go to daycare. And if I lose that, I don't honestly know how I'll be able to provide as a mother to them. And I don't want to let them down, you know? And I feel like if I lose transportation, then I'm letting my own kids down because I can't bring them to and from. I can't provide them with that type of services myself. So I guess that's where.
And I know it's hard to share, but we were talking about how it has a domino effect. Our program has the food program, and that's 4 meals a day she's going to lose. 4 meals a day she's going to have to provide for 5 kids. So it is really the foundation of getting these kids in care.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So to be sure, no decisions on transportation as yet. We have the study in hand. We discussed it at the retreat. We will keep this moving through fiscal. Are there other folks who signed up whom we haven't called on? Thank you. We don't have any routine business. We'll pick up on minutes next month, and the workforce advisory update will fold into the QRS presentation. So let's turn now to the subsidy regulations. I'll ask Felicia Sullivan, Tom Meyers, and Carol Meehan to come up and look forward to the presentation.
Chairperson Lasso, Secretary Pizer, Commissioner Weber, members of the board, thank you for the opportunity to be here today. Again, I'm Tom Meyers. I'm joined by Felicia Policy and Regulation changes. I would just note before we get started that we did present proposed changes in January. Since then, we have gotten a lot of feedback from stakeholders. We engaged a lot of stakeholders. We engaged with our secretariat, the governor's office, and several parties. We also had a lot of outreach to other states to make sure that we have thoughtful revisions to these regulations. So we'll walk you through these today. So the first 2 slides here are just a refresher from our prior presentation in January. So just to give a quick overview, as you know, the Child Care Development Block Grant is the federal law that authorizes the Child Care Development Fund and is the federal primary funding source for EEC. This was reauthorized in September of 2014, which made sweeping changes to child care, and we're required to implement those changes effective September 30th of 2018. Really the goals of these were to increase access and stability for families while also maintaining the program integrity of the subsidy program. The goal for EEC, as we'll get into more detail throughout the presentation here, is to implement this in 2 phases. So we will do an interim policy guidance, which will be effective October 1st of 2018, and then through regulatory changes effective February 1st of 2019. So. One of the benefits of the new CCDBG requirements, again, this is a refresher from our prior presentation, but the overall goals of CCDBG were to strengthen the requirements to protect health and safety of children, help parents make informed consumer decisions, and provide high-quality access to childcare for low-income families. They do this through the delivery of child care financial assistance for 12 continuous months. This, along with decreased reporting requirements throughout the 12-month period, a more streamlined absence policy that we're going to be proposing. We believe here at EEC that this will reduce the burden on families and provide continuity of care for families. We also see that there's increased flexibility under CCDBG to better serve homeless families and priority populations through the more expansive definition of McKinneyVento that we'll be utilizing. It also allows us to develop a more formalized system to ensure program integrity within our system to deter improper payments and any fraudulent activities. So what we plan to do and what we'll talk through today is to establish a process to investigate and recover fraudulent payments, and then also implement and impose sanctions on clients or providers, which is actually consistent with what other states are doing. So we'll go through that in more detail. So to give a little bit of background and context here, so this slide will outline kind of the theme for the presentation going forward. So we have in yellow here, which is going to be phase 1, which is going to be the interim policy guidance that will be effective October 1st. So we will implement these changes that we'll detail throughout the presentation as of October 1. And then anything in green will be phase 2, and this will be changes that we'll make through the regulatory process, and those we anticipate will be effective in February 1st of 2019 after the completion of the regulatory process. So this is just a quick overview of some of the changes that we'll get into more detail in as we go through this presentation. So again, here highlighted in yellow are the changes that will take place for the interim policy, and these are all changes that will benefit the family. So to increase family access, improve stability, all beneficial changes. This includes providing 12-month authorizations to families, using the McKinney-Vento definition of homelessness, as well as allowing for a 12-week job search throughout the 12-month authorization period. We'll also discuss the requirement to not connect provider payments or termination with a child's occasional absences. So essentially not terminating for excessive explained absences or delinking those provider payments. Also not increasing the family co-payment during the 12-month authorization. The last one in the interim would be limiting recoupment to cases of substantiated fraud. So currently what we do is there's a process where there's improper payments where may not be a fraud case. We would no longer apply that. We would just limit recoupment to actual fraud cases. So those were all changes in the interim period, and again highlighted in yellow. Then we'll get into more detail about some of the regulatory changes that will take effect in February. And this will be the requiring of non-temporary changes during the 12-month authorization period, so the reporting requirements. We will define intentional program violation and what that constitutes, and for what the purpose is of maintaining eligibility for termination. We'll also define what substantiated fraud is and go through the sanctions and recoupment process. So this is just a brief timeline to discuss where we are at. So here in gray in August through October, a lot of these have been underway. So we are drafting the interim policy guidance for release. We are working on IT enhancements for our own database, as well as some other state agencies, including DTA, that will have to enhance their databases to accommodate the 12-month authorization. So those are all underway. Right now, September 12th, we are here presenting for a discussion on these changes. And then beginning next week, on September 17th, we will begin mandatory trainings for subsidy administrators. So these are the contracted providers and CCR&Rs that will attend trainings as of next week and the following week to give them an overview and training of these interim policies. As of October 1, the interim policy guidance will take effect, and we'll also begin the regulatory process. So we anticipate coming back before the board in October, asking for a vote for public comment to initiate that process, and then ultimately coming back in December, hopefully for a vote to promulgate those regulations and get everything codified and in effect for February. So that is a very high-level overview timeline of where we anticipate going. So now to get into the actual content here, so we'll first talk about the first piece is the providing 12-month authorization. So under the final rules we've discussed before, CCDBG requires that we issue no less than 12-month authorizations for all child care vouchers and slots. So currently what we're doing here is EEC for the most part does 12-month authorizations in our income eligible program. There are certain situations with DTA or DCF where there are shorter authorization periods. So for the most part we're in compliance right now. But in the interim policy, what we'll be doing is we'll be moving all of these authorizations to 12 months. So income eligible, DCF, and DTA will all have 12-month authorizations. So we'll be moving towards that October 1st in the interim policy. Now, with the additional changes for February, we will codify that process to move to 12-month authorizations, and we'll also add in some additional requirements. So in an effort to align state agencies and definitions, we'll be using the Executive Office of Labor and Workforce definitions of vocational training programs. So we will cite to those in our regulations so that we can cite to any approved vocational programs that will qualify under this new 12-month authorization. We'll also look at ESOL and GED service needs, and we will still allow these service needs, but we will limit these to one 12-month authorization period, as long as this is their sole service need. So if they're combining a service need with, if they're working and attending a GED program at night or something like that, they would still, they wouldn't be limited to the 12-month period. But if they're using it as their sole service need, then it would be limited to that one 12-month period. So the next piece is using the McKinneyVento definition of homelessness. So this is another requirement under CCDBG. They do require that you implement this definition. So right now, we don't have a specific, under our current regulations and policies, we don't have a specific definition of homelessness. Instead, we include it under our protective services definition. And so we allow referrals from DHCD or DCF, essentially confirming that a homeless family is involved with a DHCD-funded shelter, and then they can get priority for services through our contracted slots and our contracted providers. So there is access there. What we will be doing in the interim period is actually implementing this McKinneyVento definition. So we will apply that in the policy. However, during this interim period, we won't make any changes to access. There'll still be that same requirement that there's a referral from DHCD or DCF that they're involved in one of these shelters, and that's just for the interim period. However, moving forward, as we get to February with the regulatory process, we will codify that definition of McKinneyVento, but then we're also going to extend homelessness as its own service need. So it's not going to limit it to these DHCD shelters. Instead, anyone that is identified as being homeless under McKinneyVento will allow to use that as a service need for up to 2 years. So we'll give 2 years of this service, and then if they need additional time after that, it would be an EEC review to see whether we could extend it beyond the 2-year initial. So during that process, we'll also be looking to codify some eligibility, the process for determining eligibility under McKinneyVento. So that is the plan for February on that. The next piece is the allowance of a 12-week job search. So what CCDBG requires is that if a parent or a family loses their service needs, so if they lose their job during the 12-month authorization, that the agency must allow for a 12-week job search to find an additional service need. So, and they also require that there's multiple job searches allowed throughout the 12-month authorization. For someone that loses their job, gets another job, and then loses it again, they should be able to have multiple job search periods. So what our current practice is that we do allow for a job search period, which is actually 8 weeks. We do allow for an extension of up to 12, so a 4-week extension that brings it to 12. But we limit it to one 12-week during the authorization period. So during this interim policy, what we will do is we will implement a 12-week job search, and we will allow this job search to occur multiple times throughout the authorization period if a parent is in and out of work.
And when you say multiple, are you thinking of an upper bound? Is there guidance from the Fed on the upper bound of the number of searches, or it's open?
As to the number of searches that are allowed during the 12-month period?
Right, so this is
Yeah.
multiple.
Yeah, they didn't put any cap on it, so they basically said that, and we're not going to allow back-to-back searches. So if someone exhausts their 12-week job search and they don't have a service need at the end of that, we wouldn't necessarily allow for another one. But if someone, in that 12 weeks gains employment, and then further down the road they lose employment, we would then issue another 12-week job search, and there's no cap to the amount of times that we can do that during the 12-month period.
What's the rationale for not allowing it to be consecutive? You're saying you wouldn't allow for a consecutive?
So what we would do is the policy that we would have in place is that during the 12 weeks, if they came back to us with, so we do require a lot of documentation. We require documentation to verify that they're working. So for instance, 4 weeks of pay stubs. So if they came back at the end of the 12-month authorization, or the 12-week job search, and they had a preliminary documentation. So they found a job, they didn't have the 4 weeks of pay stubs. We may extend that for an additional 8 weeks to allow them to get the additional documentation, but we wouldn't issue another 12-week job search.
Okay, thank you.
So the next piece here is related to absences and not connecting provider payments or termination with a child's occasional absences. So basically what the rationale here is that CCDBG wants states to pay for a percentage of absences that a child doesn't attend the program. Now, EEC was a little bit ahead of the game compared to other states in that we already paid for a good portion of absences. A lot of other states just paid for when a child attends a certain program and doesn't pay for any other days. So our current policy was that we actually allowed for 30 absences in a 6-month period. Anything beyond 30 absences within that rolling 6-month period would result in termination. We would also terminate for excessive unexplained absences where a child that doesn't attend the program for 3 straight days and there's no contact to the program. So a no-show, no-call, essentially. This would result in a termination. So this is our current practice. Under CCDBG, they do recommend paying for a percentage of absences, and they give some guidance on that as far as a benchmark of paying for the full cost of childcare with the expectation that the child attends 85% of the time. So the idea is that you pay for at least 15% of a child's absences, and that isn't a requirement, it's just a benchmark outlined in the rule. So in order to comply with this during the interim period, we're going to discontinue the 30-day absence termination and non-payment. We will leave in place the consecutive unexplained absences as that's consistent with CCDBG, but the termination for 30 days, in excess of 30 days, is not consistent, so we would essentially discontinue that practice during the interim period. The ultimate goal, though, is through the regulatory process is we would codify a absence policy that would allow EEC to pay for up to 45 absences in a 12-month period. Rather than terminating after that 45, so if they exceed the 45 number, the parent may be billed for the full rate for each additional absence beyond 45. And EEC will continue the same practice of the unexplained absences. We would still allow for termination for 3 consecutive unexplained absences, but we would revise the policy on absences related to explained absences.
I'm just curious as to if you know the fallout of what the termination might be, the numbers of kids that are affected by this, a 3-day termination?
On the 3-day termination?
We don't have specific numbers, but the majority of our terminations are for the 30 days, not for the 3 consecutive unexplained. There is already a requirement that the provider reaches out on the 4th day, and we continue that requirement, that they make some attempt to contact the parent. And so it's not, I don't have exact numbers, it's not as significant as the 30-day total.
Board member, you're asking what the follow would be for this if it were a new policy because it's the existing policy, or are you just asking how, in fact, is it currently playing out?
In fact, right. I'm particularly concerned with families who might send their kids away for a period of time and then come back, and what happens.
The biggest thing is they just have to contact the provider and let them know. Either let them know in advance or call that day and say the child's going is sick or the child is going to another visit. So that it's mainly a safety issue more than anything else, not having a child show up and not knowing where they are.
Okay.
Yep.
I would just note on this piece that we've done extensive outreach to other states. We've gotten technical assistance from the federal government. We've spoken with other states. We've reviewed state plans and looking at other absence policies. And a lot in our proposed policy is very much consistent, if not more generous than other states are doing. So what it amounts to as far as a percentage, with the 45 absences, it ends up being about 17% of the billable days. So it's a little bit higher than the benchmark by CCDBG, and it tends to be more generous than the other states that we've spoken to.
Can I just ask a question? You know, one of the things, we're involved in the campaign for grade level reading, which is the national reading campaign, and one of the criteria that they're looking at is chronic absenteeism in the early preschool years. And we obviously want to set a standard for parents about what school means and why you should show up or your child should show up. I wanted to ask the secretary, what is the current definition of chronic absenteeism, maybe I'm not even using the right language, in the elementary years, and are we in any way in alignment, or where does that look? How does that look?
I probably should know this off the top of my head, but I think it's 10%.
I think
Am I right?
10% of, so 18,
My picture.
10% of what? I'm sorry, Mr. Secretary.
So 18 days
Okay, it is, all right, yeah, okay. 18 days in a year.
in a year.
And we're 30 days in, what's the period?
Well, now we're gonna go to 45 in a year.
45, yeah.
Just an interesting
I
thing
know.
to mull over.
It's a good point to bring up, yeah.
I mean, I think, again, it's back to helping families understand the value and importance of attendance, and I just worry a little bit. Not that we can do much about it, it doesn't appear, but it's a pretty mixed message in terms of preparing families for our expectations once these little people make it to, you know, traditional
But just
kindergarten.
Just keep in mind, obviously, that even given that number of absences in the early education space, that's still more days in total than would be the case in the 180-day school year. So,
True. Right.
because of summer and
Because of
other
full year,
vacations
yeah.
and things like that,
Okay,
yeah.
okay.
I accept your
You're
point.
able to
I
do
get your
that
point.
analysis. I'm not sure I think it's
Yeah.
still, it's just at least something that we ought to pay attention to.
My sense, I shouldn't say my guess, because I did talk to one person about this at the Fed, but my sense is that this is in part coming out of the sort of trauma-informed practice, which is that we're going for as much consistency as we can, and that the absent young child is sort of has no agency by which to get there. And so the idea is this is at the parent level. I agree with you. There's also this, at what point is it not as good a family engagement strategy? But my sense is that this is partly the trauma-informed piece, which is that we want this site to be as consistent as possible.
And I will also harken back to 100 years ago when I had young children. We spent a lot of time in pediatric doctor's offices because little children get quite a bit of illness. So, you know, I think there's a balance there, but it's just something that, you know, causes me a little pause. Sheila
I was going
has.
to say, on the plus side, the 12-month authorizations are wonderful, aren't they? I mean, we had turnover every 3 months. It was ongoing.
So the next requirement under CCDBG is to not increase the family co-payment during the 12-month authorization period. And this is, again, to increase family stability. Right now, under current practice, anytime there's a reported change in an income, it results in a co-payment change. So we require parents to report any 20%, up to 20% change in their income, and we would reevaluate them to see whether that would impact their co-payment and raise or lower their co-payment accordingly. So CCDBG does not allow you to do that anymore. The only kind of caveat to this is that if we have a co-payment and then we reduce it at some point during the 12-month authorization period because they lose their job or they have less income, we can bring it back up later during the 12-month authorization, but not to exceed that original amount. So there is that ability to bring it back up and not to beyond that originally established amount. So during the interim policy, we will discontinue the practice of increasing family co-payments within the 12-month authorization period, consistent with that same caveat that we will reduce it and potentially bring it back up. Then, as far as the February changes, we will codify that practice. We will also implement additional requirements, and this is going to be on providers just to ensure that fees are actually collected on a weekly basis. So one thing that we do see is a kind of a systematic problem with providers not collecting parent fees. And we do see this, and a lot of times it's they think to help the families and that they're not going to charge the families on a certain week or something, but it actually causes hindrance to the families as they accumulate balances that become, unmanageble. So, and it's also not a good business practice for the providers to be going forfeiting parent fees as well. So what we will be doing is codifying additional restrictions on providers and requirements on providers to collect parent fees on a weekly basis, and failure to do so may result in penalties for the provider.
So any creative thinking there about how to ameliorate that for them, so we can come down with more policy and more on the penalty side, but I wonder about helping with that. Is it a dynamic? Is it we don't see the parents? Is it tough to ask for the money? I mean, I wonder on the service side if we could help them here. And whether we've given any thought to that, since we're going on the punitive sense.
Yeah, it's a little bit of everything. We have found providers that will use it as a recruitment method to get a parent to go to that program and say, you know, we won't necessarily collect your fees, or we'll be more lenient on it. But then when the parent tries to leave and go to another program, they bill the parent the full amount, which can be thousands of dollars. And so it essentially then holds a parent hostage, potentially in a program that they would like to leave but can't. And that's usually where we see it. We see a parent panicking, saying, this provider never made me pay, I want to change programs, or my child's aging out to school age, and I'm no longer going to be there anymore, but I owe thousands of dollars. And so the penalty is really just any provider that accrues more than a 3-week balance, they have to eat that balance. And so that's lost revenue for them. Not necessarily, we're not going to impose additional penalties, but they won't be able to go after the parents at the end of the fact for it. And a lot.
For them too. So there's a way in which,
Yeah.
if we could back it up a little, like, so this recruitment piece is an interesting.
Yeah, we've done a lot of work with encouraging providers to collect it on a regular basis as the business practice, as ensuring sound business practices, ensuring your total revenue. And providers that have had historic issues with it that we've worked with, we've seen a lot of improvement in that once they put in good policies and practices in place to collect the fees. And they have been able to gain a lot of revenue and gain that a little bit more stability through that. But it's a matter of making sure that everyone is doing it equally.
Tom, has there been any thought at all, when looking at the penalties, is there any way to flip that and look at some incentives to encourage providers to establish or use one, at least within their own agency system for collecting fees? As opposed to it being a penalty-driven process, is there a way to, maybe not financially, but as a way to incentivize the providers to, let's say, do a more effective job of collecting some of these?
Yeah, I certainly think that's something that we can consider, and as we, go through the public comment period and have opportunities to change the regulations, I think that we can certainly consider that and, consider potential changes that may offer some incentives to these providers. Thank you, David.
So I understand the rationale behind it. What about the situation where you have a provider who's not trying to sort of game the system in the way that you describe around recruitment, but in fact has a family who enters a period of more significant economic distress, they're not able to make payment, and the provider wants to be flexible so that the child can remain in care. But 3 weeks may not be enough to resolve all of the things that can happen, right? So to what extent is there any discretion? Is this just a straight up, sort of penalty/incentive to the provider to collect on a regular basis regardless of circumstance, or is there some latitude that would allow a provider to exercise appropriate discretion in a narrow set of circumstances for families?
So there's no prohibition from a provider entering into a repayment agreement for a parent that does owe a balance, so say they get maybe a week or two behind, to maybe enter into an alternative repayment agreement. I think the biggest thing is that I would be concerned about is that making sure if that a family is in sudden financial distress, that somebody's talked to that family, okay, did you have a drop in income? Is there something we can do to reduce your parent fee? Is there something else going on that we need to look at that's more than just us not collecting your fee on a particular day, but looking at it holistically to see. And it might not be something we can do. Their income, they might have just had a increase unexpected expense that they didn't know about. But to still make sure that they're keeping that in mind and having that conversation with the family to make sure that everything that can be done for the family is, without necessarily jumping to repayments. But like I said, we don't prohibit providers from entering into repayment agreements or taking on their own volition to forgive some of the debt or do any of that. There's no prohibition of that. It's more of the fact that if it comes to the end of it and they try to go after the parent for a large sum of money, that's where we would enter and say that you wouldn't be allowed to do it.
And we also have an opportunity when we create the policy guide to address that scenario as well. So that's a good thing to keep in mind when we're working on the policy guide.
Perhaps a few scenarios, right, that would kind of help with the kind of teaching and guiding principles of what's possible here.
Great, thank you. So the next requirement on this slide is limiting recoupment to cases of substantiated fraud. So this is a requirement under CCDBG. Under current practice, we do have recoupment practices for any improper payment. So this may be fraud, but this also may be some a parent or a family not reporting circumstances that would change their eligibility, and we could potentially recoup on that. So the current or the new requirements is that we only recoup if there's actually fraud involved. So under the interim policy, we will be implementing this policy that recoupment is limited to cases of substantiated fraud, which we will define and get into more detail in a couple of slides. So the next requirement under CCDBG is to limit the parent reporting requirements during the 12-month authorization, and this is to kind of reduce the burden on families. So what they do is they put required reporting is based off of non-temporary changes during the 12-month authorization, and they require the states to actually define what this non-temporary change is. So under current practice, we require parents to report any substantial change. So this is income changes of 20% or more, changes in household composition, service need change, change of address, a whole bunch of information that is required during this authorization period. So we will be limiting that to just a definition of non-temporary changes, which we plan to implement in the interim policy. So under the interim non-temporary change, during the 12-month authorization, parents will be required to report income only if it exceeds 85% of the state median income. And that's a requirement under CCDBG. And there's also a requirement under CCDBG that if they move out of state, so if they move out of the Commonwealth, they'd no longer be eligible, so they would have to be required to report that. So those are two pieces that are specifically required by CCDBG that we will be implementing. The other four are under EEC's discretion to include within the non-temporary change, which we are defining as any change in household composition if it's expected to last for more than 30 days during the 12-month authorization period, any change in child custody arrangements, a change in service need, or if they're no longer in the need of the subsidy, that we would require them to report that. So we're limiting the changes to just these requirements here. Now, as far as the additional changes with the regulatory process, we will codify these non-temporary change definitions, and then we will also codify any enforcement of these, and we'll get into that in just a couple of slides. Sure.
So if you report that you no longer have a service need or you're no longer in need of a subsidy, what happens at that point?
So if they reported that they lost their service need, we would put a 12-week job search, and they would allow them to find an additional job during that 12-week period. If they came back, as I mentioned before, at any point in that 12 weeks and they documented a full service need, they would continue their 12-month authorization. If they come back with preliminary proof, so we have an employment verification form, but we haven't gotten the pay stubs, we may extend that 12-week job search to another 8 weeks to allow them to get all the documentation. If they know...
Is that the most typical case, or is that really kind of the only case that would fit this particular reporting requirement?
That is probably the most common that we would see, is that they don't have enough documentation to verify. They're not going to meet our verification process. They don't have enough pay stubs to meet it, so they only have one or two.
They've lost their job. That's the change in the service need,
Mm-hmm.
and it sort of triggers the 12-week clock,
Right.
or it may have started previously. Are there other scenarios that might arise here? Or
As far as a change in service need, I
Yeah.
mean, really any change in service need would result in a 12-week. So if they came back and they said, I'm no longer enrolled in just in an educational facility, or I'm no longer enrolled in a vocational program, they would report that, and we would still allow them 12 weeks to find an additional service need. So it's not just losing a job, but any service need.
in some cases, their service need just may change from one service need to another, and they need to report that as well.
Right, correct.
And then again, if they no longer need a subsidy, if they report they no longer need a subsidy, what's the implication of that?
So if they no longer needed the subsidy, then their subsidy would end at that point. I believe we do allow if they were to come back within 30 days.
Is there any upside to them to report this? What I'm asking.
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
do have the
Other than
option.
honesty is
Yeah.
always, appreciated and valued somewhere.
Parents do have the option of an approved break-in service as well. They can put their subsidy on hold for up to 90 days. So if, say, they're traveling out of the country, or they don't need the subsidy for a given period of time, they have the option of just putting it on hold. So they can if they're going out of the country, they can do whatever they need, or if they just need a break or they're not going to have a temporary break in service need, they don't. It's not required. And then a lot of the voluntary terminations are when children are aging out or they're going to school age programs in the middle of the 12-month authorization and they simply don't need the care anymore.
And also, if they're no longer using the subsidy, it's also beneficial for the family to report because they're accruing absences. And after the 45 days, they may be billed at the state subsidized rate, so they may, in fact, be billed for those days they're not using it. So it would be in their best interest to report that they're no longer in need of it, and rather than accrue those absences.
I know as a state, we're taking a look at the issue of the cliff effect. So in the current circumstance, if I'm working and I get a promotion and it puts me in, my income exceeds 85%, immediately my child loses all subsidy. So there's a huge disincentive at the moment, not that you've created, but nonetheless, a huge disincentive for upward mobility. I mean, we've heard testimony of families where they pass up a promotion because of this issue.
So more often than not, what we actually see is that they're not exceeding 85%, but their income increases so much that their parent fee goes up. And so that's kind of solved by the other piece of it where we can't increase their parent fee during the 12 months. So right now, unless their income exceeds 85%, which given the SMI in this state is actually fairly high, we don't see that as much, that part of the cliff effect as much, as what we see more is parents when they report that 20% change in income, all their new income is now going to a higher parent fee. And so that's where we more see families turning down increases because of that, rather than because of the loss of their subsidy.
Just to follow up on that point, so the 12-month authorization with the protection against increases is at least a step towards this addressing this cliff effect issue you raised.
Thank you.
Thank you. So the next piece, a requirement under CCDBG, is to define intentional program violation for purposes of eligibility termination. So this is not a term that EEC currently defines. So we do have methods for terminating a child care subsidy by failure to maintain certain program requirements. But this, the CCDBG requires that we actually have a term for it and outline what could potentially result in a termination of the child care subsidy. So under the interim policy, we will issue the actual definition. Really, the goal here is to get it in the policy guide and get providers familiar with it, but we will not necessarily enforce these actions until it goes through the regulatory process and we codify that procedure. So we will have the definition in place, but there'll be no enforcement of that. Once we go through the regulatory process and come February, the goal is to begin enforcing these intentional program violations. And basically what we'll be defining it as a parent's failure to adhere to EEC subsidy requirements, and this would include failing to report a non-temporary change, failing to accurately report income at the eligibility assessment or reassessment, failure to respond to EEC's request for more information, and any non-payment of fees, including fees that are associated with the excessive absences.
So with regard to failure to respond to an EEC request for more information, what is the reasonable time standard that you apply currently to responding?
So that would be, I believe in the proposed regs, that would be 30 days.
30 calendar or business?
Calendar.
Thank you.
They're all calendar. Yeah, I believe so, yeah. Oh. Yes, Joan.
How can we ensure that all of these expectations are clearly communicated to families? And how do you think about the relationship between intentional program violation and fraud? Is that one and the same? Are you treating them differently? Can you walk me through
Sure,
what
absolutely.
leads to recoupment versus termination versus?
Yeah, so we do have two definitions. We have intentional program violation, and we have substantiated fraud. And when we were coming up with this, we actually did extensive outreach and looking at other states and looking at other state plans. We spoke with a lot of other states. And within the final rule in CCDBG, they reference both intentional program violations and fraud. Now, some states have combined them into one, so they have one overarching definition that encompasses all of this, and other states have broken them into two. So we actually broke them into two. with intentional program violation kind of being a failure to report certain information that affects your eligibility, whereas fraud is the actual providing of false information or willfully concealing information that relates to your subsidy. So we broke that into the two different requirements. What we've seen from other states is that while they combine them into one, it's more of a broad definition, and this definition actually encompasses all of the things that we have identified as intentional program violations. They just encompass it into one definition. And we think the reason that they do this is that a lot of the states that we spoke with have this intentional program violation and sanctions that they have encompasses many state agencies. So it's not just the subsidy program, but it's multiple agencies. So for them to put specific requirements on what an intentional program violation would be wouldn't serve their purpose, because it has to span a number of agencies. We've also seen a lot of states that have data sharing initiatives that actually help and aid in this process of identifying whether parents are providing fraudulent information, which allows them to kind of better track this. And I know that's something that Massachusetts is working on and hoping to have something in the future, but we're kind of behind the ball on that as far as other states and what they're doing.
And so how do parents know what they're supposed to do? And particularly, do we think that there's a risk of confusion if folks are basically told, you don't have to worry about this for 12 months, you're all set for 12 months, and yet there's still some of these interim reporting requirements? That feels like a place where folks could unintentionally get tripped up.
So we've actually been working on docket. That's been kind of at the forefront of our minds about how to best educate parents on these new policies. We've actually been working on a very simple kind of like parent information sheet that's just really simple of, what do you need to do to maintain your subsidy? What do you need to do? What do you need to report? What do you need to make sure you do? You need to make sure you reassess on time. You need to make sure, here are the things you need to report, in very clear, easy to understand language. Most of our parents in our subsidy system are used to having to report things, so they're probably actually in the first few months, in the first year, probably going to over-report more than they have to. And so that'll be, we will be talking a lot with our subsidy administrators about how to best help and walk the families through it. We are requiring annual reassessments as much as possible, unless there's a significant reason why, to be in person, so that the subsidy administrator can spend valuable time with the parent, explaining the policies, explaining exactly what the responsibilities are, and not rushing through the process, not rushing through the assessment, but really kind of sitting down and walking through the information sheet, walking through, it's very simple. We've created as kind of like a one-page thing they can put on their fridge, or they can, put right front and center. And it even lists, like, here's the documents you should have been given today. Make sure you have these. It talks about how to ask questions and where information's on our website and how they can reach EEC. Just as kind of like a general one-page, very short, succinct thing of, here's just what you need to do to keep your eligibility.
But nobody's going to be dragged off to jail if they don't report that their income went up slightly at the end of 12 months. So, I mean, it's...
I think the draft regs would suggest if you go through the first year and you fail to do that, you're basically given a warning. And the penalties could kick in at the end of the second year of authorization.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. So the next requirement here is defining substantiated fraud, sanctions, and recoupment process. So this, again, is a requirement under CCDBG to maintain program integrity. So right now, current practice, EEC doesn't have a definition of substantiated fraud. We do have a definition of fraud that we will potentially terminate child care and recoup funds for any false or misleading information that's submitted to EEC, but we will have a specific definition of substantiated fraud. So again, similar to intentional program violation, we will implement this in the interim period, and we will continue current practice regarding identifying fraud and recouping in that process. So a little bit of changes here from what we currently define fraud as, but we'll, in the interim period, as well as what we'll codify, is defining substantiated fraud as providing false or misleading information or documentation to EEC or a subsidy administrator, or the concealing or withholding of information for the purpose of establishing or maintaining eligibility as determined by the Bureau of Special Investigations or successor agency. So the additional language here is to just ensure that this information was concealed or withheld was in fact fraud. So BSI is an organization that we have an MOU with that does a lot of our investigations to determine whether fraud was substantiated. So we put this language in here to kind of distinguish between someone that just forgot to report and didn't necessarily try to withhold this information. So we would have the Bureau of Special Investigations investigate, and if they provided this information to another state agency but didn't provide it to us, then we might be able to document that this was actually willfully withholding to maintain a benefit. So that's why we added that additional language in there. We also include under this substantiated fraud. So this is all under the guise of increasing the level of child care assistance that has been verified as false or misleading by EEC or a subsidy administrator. So in the interim policy, we will continue to terminate care and recruit for substantiated fraud. And then the next slide is just the additional changes in regulations. So come February, related to the same intentional program violations and substantiated fraud, we will be instituting a sanction system. So again, this is something that we conducted a lot of outreach both to the feds for guidance. We looked at other states and state plans. We also spoke with a lot of states and how they implement and kind of maintain this program integrity. And from what we found, 45 states across the nation have some sort of sanctions in place. The majority of these processes look like this, where they're a tiered sanction system. We looked at a lot of peer states that we identify with, and they have similar processes in place where there's a tiered system. Many of the states that we actually looked at actually impose lifetime bans as well, which is not something that we're looking to do. So what we're proposing for our sanction system is under the first offense of an intentional program violation or a third offense of non-payment of fees. So this is to track against people that are constantly switching providers and not paying fees. This would actually result in a warning to the parent. So as Secretary Pizer mentioned, there'd be a warning to the parent. They wouldn't face any sanctions, but if this were to happen again, if there was a second offense, then it would bring you to the first potential penalty, which would be a 12-month ban. Following that, it would go up by 12 months, so it would be a 12, 24, and 36-month ban, depending on the level of or the number of violations. As far as substantiated fraud, if we do have providing false or misleading information, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to ask, my concern is that, sometimes you get a request for additional information and life gets in the way. And so I know you said that you have a 30-day standard for submission of information. So when you go and develop your interim policy, are you going to define the period of time of withholding information? Because I think that failure to respond to request could be interpreted as withholding of information unless you give specific timelines that, after so many days. Because my concern would be is that someone's actions are interpreted as withholding where it was actually just failure to respond because of other life circumstances.
Right. And that's a good point, and we'll certainly put days on the number of days that they'll have to respond to a request. And as far as reporting of changes, we do have a time associated with that they have to report a change within so many days. And again, with the withholding of information, and that's kind of why we added in the Bureau of Special Investigations, because we don't want to necessarily dock someone for concealing, withholding, and being a 3-year ban if they forgot about something. So that's why we'd have it investigated and see if they, there's documentation to show that they purposefully withheld this information.
I just maybe try to clarify this one more level. So as I interpret this, the concealing or withholding information is related to an investigation by the Bureau, right? So if there's no investigation, if you're concealing, which you might be, right, by not reporting, it's not problematic from a fraud point of view until an investigation is opened and you're essentially asked the question and then you conceal or withhold the information that's being requested. Is that a fair characterization of it?
Yeah, because my concern was it went to the definition of substantiated fraud.
Does that go too far? I agreed with everything up to the last part. Which is, I don't know that it's the concealing as part of the investigation, but rather whether or not the investigation determines that you were purposefully, willfully concealing it in a manner that would.
But it does raise the question about if you don't report it because you didn't want to, that would make you liable for fraud. Essentially, you would have committed fraud at that point, you just wouldn't have been caught. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yep. Yep.
So, yeah. So I do think, I do think it raises these, we gotta, just, again, in public comment, it would be great to hear some feedback on this, whether we're kind of striking the right balance, because you could certainly imagine people not reporting because they're afraid of losing their benefit. Whether they really would or not is, may be irrelevant. So if that is determined to be true, or put it differently, if it's determined that by other databases or something like that, they would show that they were no longer at a service need, then they could be in some jeopardy around fraud. And I guess, and the question is, again, whether we're defining this clearly enough so that the willfulness, and I know that's also an inexact term, is kind of is the driver here. But again, the failure to respond or the failure to report and concealment and withholding in some ways are all the same thing, except if it's just, gee, it slipped my mind or I didn't get the letter.
Right, and I think my concern is that, fraud is an intentional intent crime, specific intent crime, and that withholding information or failing to respond to a request for information, can sometimes happen because of other circumstances. I don't want to see someone get tripped up because it's within the discretion of an individual to determine which was which, and I think there needs to be standards established so that something that's unintentional doesn't fall within that category.
And it could be also that some of the non-temporary changes don't lead to a service need change, right? So, in fact, they wouldn't be receiving a benefit illegally, if you will. They just wouldn't have reported a change.
And I think that goes to the issue of, if it says for the purpose of establishing or maintaining eligibility, so I guess it would need to be determined that they would no longer have been eligible that caused them to withhold
And that they knew that.
information. Correct.
And that they knew that, right, exactly.
Anyway, we're all of us investigators here. We're really on the case.
This is very much in your line of work, yes.
EEC does have that memorandum of understanding with BSI, and we meet with them regularly, and when they write up their reports, they provide a determination at the end whether it was fraud or whether it was just a program violation. So we'll definitely need to have more conversations with them, when we implement the new policy and regulations, to make sure that we're all on the same page about what's fraud versus what's actually an intentional program violation, and that the intent standard is actually being met when they're doing their investigation.
Okay, thank you. So the next slide here is just identifying some potential issues of stakeholder interest. So this is just a couple of issues we've identified that we've already gotten feedback on throughout the process from when we first presented and throughout this period here. So a lot of this we've already addressed. The absence policy is something that we've gotten a lot of feedback on, and again, as we noted before, this is something that is, we're meeting the benchmark of CCDBG with the 15% of absences, actually paying for a little bit more than that, and not terminating for excessive absences. So although the parents may be billed for any absences over 45, they're not losing their subsidy. So there are a lot of benefits to this absence policy versus what we currently have. Again, a lot of the sanctions is a piece that we've gotten a lot of feedback on, and again, as we mentioned before, we've done a lot of research on this, and we've looked at a lot of states. We've had phone calls with states. We've looked at state plans, a lot of guidance from the feds. We were at a conference in Washington, D.C. For the state administrators, and we spoke with a lot of people during those conferences. And this is the standard practice across the nation that we've seen. As I mentioned, 45 states have this in place, have some sort of sanctions, and a majority of those 45 do a tiered system very similar to the one that we proposed. And then the last piece that we've gotten some feedback is just the provider responsibilities and for the parent fee, and placing those additional restrictions and requirements on providers to actually collect the fees. And again, we want to really highlight that this actually is going to be a benefit, even though it comes across as a sanction on the providers or the parents, but it's actually ensuring that parents or providers are actually collecting fees. It's good for business for them. It's good for the parents for not allowing them to accrue a balance that becomes unmanageable for them down the road. So overall, we think that this actually will be, once it's put into practice, be an overall benefit.
So just to flag though, when we think about our workforce development and business management practices and just thinking in general, that this is one area that may need a bit of a look to kind of say, how are we really supporting that shift? Is it cultural, you know, root cause is partly, is it cultural, is it tactical, et cetera, and we should be able to articulate how we're gonna help the field get to that, since it's stated here as a systemic issue in the field.
Absolutely.
We should articulate how it is we're gonna help them get to that better place on both sides.
Absolutely, thank you. So that's it. Any other questions, or? Joni?
So I appreciate from my understanding the support that these new pieces will give to families as well as providers. I'm wondering, will there be positive impacts on EEC staff seeing this as one smiles?
We can probably answer both in our short term and response. Do you want to?
Yeah, I think in the short term, there's a kind of heavy burden to work right now to get it rolled out and to get all of the policies, the interim policies and forms and trainings finalized and ready. And the next 2 weeks out in the field training and then the technical assistance. I think long term, we are looking at the request for reviews, for example. We do expect those to decrease because the number of terminations of care will decrease and things like that, and kind of looking at a broad base to see with the more stable care for families, that means less potential interaction of us with the families as well. So
Down the road.
Hopefully.
The other thing I just want to mention, building on what Joan said about communicating with families, is that many of our families speak multiple languages, or don't read in their native language. So I just want to make sure that the information is given to them during their appointments, a phone call, whatever, because so many folks just miss it.
So unfortunately, this time we're not able to translate the interim policies and forms, just because would be a substantial amount of money for a 5-month, 6-month period. We are looking at, for once we have the permanent regulations and policies in place, doing our best to translate those. Many of our providers either have staff on hand, the subsidy administrators, who speak the parents' native languages. We also have a phone translation service available that can be used during parent meetings to ensure that the parent is able to understand what's being explained. As well as the providers, yes.
I just had a question about, does this have an impact on CCFA at all, or did you have to make any changes in the program? You do?
Yes.
Maybe again, answer it both short term and long term. So in the short term, actually, we've designed this to be both responsive to our CCDBG responsibilities, but also to try to minimize any impact on CCFA. That being said, we have understood for some time, and we've undertaken the requirements gathering to support CCFA development so that when we move into the fuller implementation of the regulations, those changes would be supported by CCFA as well. So those changes will have been implemented and tested under the schedule by that time. It's a great question. Every time we talk about anything internally here, usually the follow-up question is, what impact does this have on CCFA? So.
Joan?
So overall, this is a really important set of changes for children and families. It's going to create much more stability. It's what I think we've all been wanting to do for a really long time. So thank you for kind of getting us much further down the road and helping to make it possible. One of the changes that I'm cognizant of, though, is that right now, because we do have so much turnover within the system, we actually, on an annual basis, serve a much higher number of children than is necessarily reflected in our monthly caseload numbers, right? My general recollection was something like, in general, we're serving about 54,000 children per month, but on an annualized basis, it might be over 80,000. So we're likely going to end up serving fewer children better, which is good, but I'm wondering whether we might be able to, maybe on a quarterly basis, take a look at that impact on our overall numbers of children served over the course of the year, so that we can, I think, keep in mind both what we're doing on a day-to-day basis, but also kind of look annually at the lives of children and families that we're touching, and think about that when we think about access.
If I could just add to that. So the number annually is I think about 92,000. So 54,000 daily, 92,000 annually. We'd expect the churn between that 92 and 54 to shrink, perhaps considerably. So as a result of that, I think we can certainly provide updated numbers, and maybe it's on a quarterly basis. We can think about whether or not that's a good schedule, whether it should be more frequent or if that suffices. But we could certainly provide the information about the number of children who are being served daily, which shouldn't change. It's the number of children that we are serving in addition to, right, uniquely, that we can provide, and our wait list information, which we'll continue to provide to the board as well.
Other comments or questions? Well, thank you. Good luck over the next couple of weeks with the trainings. And
Tom has bigger things to celebrate in the next 2 weeks. He and his wife are expecting any minute now.
oh,
He's waiting for my phone.
So good luck.
Actually-
Good luck with that.
That's what we're both of us.
I was waiting. I was hoping that she waited until after today.
I was concerned I was going to run out mid-presentation, but so far so
That is
good.
the moment.
Thank you. Thank your wife.
Yeah.
So we'll aim to return to this in October. Tom will be much more tired.
Yeah.
And,
That's the second one. I'm good to go.
Oh,
Oh, I guess not.
All the best.
so
Based on that reaction, Tom, you
Yeah, I guess. Yeah.
recalculate.
according to the Board of Early Education.
Multiples.
So we are going to revisit this in October. The idea was for today to be a chance to weigh in, go in depth. We will return to it briefly in October. We will have a vote. It will go for public comment, and we will go from there. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All the best, Tom.
Yeah, thank you.
Good
luck.
Great. So let's turn now to the QRIS. I want to thank Anita and Amy and the crew for a lot of hard work, and we'll certainly bring some folks who are not on the Workforce Development Committee into the fold. So thank you.
Thank you all, and welcome, Carolyn. Is that your name? I'm Anita Moeller, Deputy Commissioner for Program Administration here at EC, and my colleague.
Hi, I'm Amy Whitehead-Plow. It's nice to see you.
Yeah, welcome. Please stop us. You're new, so many members have been down this path with us at many meetings, but if we use acronyms you need definition for, please stop us. So I am really excited actually to be here with you today to talk about the QRIS, and I want to thank all of you, members of the Workforce Committee, team, Tom, others that have really you've pushed us, you've challenged us, you've given us a lot to think about, and I really am proud of my team and how they've pushed and challenged each other and worked with the field to come up with what we're going to bring you today, which is what we're looking to land in October, is a streamlined QRIS that's verified in ways that are meaningful for the field, and I think we're really close. So I look forward to any discussion today, the discussion Friday at the Workforce Committee meeting, and if we need another meeting between now and the October meeting, we can think about that, but to land this in October and move forward into the hard work it's going to take to bring this to the field in a practical, usable format. So I'm excited to be here. Thank you. And thanks to Amy. So the goals, thank you. The goals of today, the objectives is I really want to do just that. I want to land this. I want the board to understand the QRIS, where it fits in our broader systems, to understand the verification process, which is the newest piece of this that we're bringing you today, with some changes in design, not hugely different design changes, but mostly bringing you the verification process, and then to think also about the supports that will be needed for the field to advance in the QRIS. As I've spoken with members of the Workforce Committee individually on the phone, between meetings, one of the big concerns has been what supports are going to be available to help programs as we lay out an ambitious definition of quality. So we're going to do that through a brief overview of what we talked about at the retreat of our professional development system. We'll talk about the emergent supports, the current emergent supports for the QRIS, and then the design and infrastructure of the QRIS 2.0 is what we're calling it, as being the second version of the QRIS. And then we'll gather your concerns, feedback, considerations, and bring it back to you in October for a vote. So as we talked about at the board retreat, addressing the challenges faced by the field, there are many, and we laid out this sort of cycle of challenges, and we talked about how no one approach is going to help us address the many challenges faced by the field. And so today I bring you this slide just to show you that the QRIS is a piece of a broader picture, addressing a piece of the challenges faced by the field, but part of a broader infrastructure where we're looking broadly at what are the standards that can support program quality, but also how does that align with our career pathways, align with our education and training opportunities, the financing, the research and evaluation in the field, and the partnerships we have with our across EEC, across secretariats, and with the field. And also I want to highlight here at the beginning that, as I said, this is an ambitious definition of quality, and it will require us to align our supports, our current supports and our emergent supports, in bringing it to reality for programs. So there are many resources right now at EEC. We have our staff across every division. We have contracts that are in place in the field, whether it's with family child care systems, resource and referral agencies, our many contractors that do research and training. We have raters, coaches, and many grants going out year after year, and partnerships across EOE and across secretariats that help us bring this work daily. This happens, but the challenge is to align our current infrastructure, our current resources, our current grants and contracts, our staff, and our emerging resources, such as Tom talked about earlier, the Workforce Council, or we're calling it the Career Pathways funding, the Commonwealth Preschool grants, new line items coming to EEC, the coaching infrastructure that we've been thinking about in terms of bringing public-private partnerships together to support coaching, our IT infrastructure, existing and future, and our emerging research and data unit to think about. So I challenge you to think about all of these current and available and emerging resources and how we can align them in support of the vision for quality that we're going to lay out for you in the ensuing slides. And to stay true to our guiding principle that we established early on in this process, to try and match our expectations with our available resources and supports. So at the retreat, we talked about the next steps, and so today we're at the stage of bringing you the 2.0 verification process in particular, as I mentioned, to bring us to a vote in October, hopefully. And then shortly thereafter, we begin to develop interim standards, which I think are really important to take some time to think about in terms of what that means is a bridge between the current QRIS and the QRIS 2.0. So things that we plan to do in the very short order is removing some of the parts of the current QRIS that weren't proven to be important in terms of the quality outcomes that were found in the validation studies, such as MOUs. Potentially, we're examining looking at the healthcare consultant requirement that are not included in this new version of the QRS 2.0. So remove things that won't be coming forward, and building technical assistance in parts of the current QRIS that will be emphasized in the future. For example, using the class tool right now is allowed right now. Many programs choose to use the RNet. There's a continuous quality improvement plan in the current QRIS, but we're having much greater emphasis and support around that in the future. So we'll reduce things that aren't moving forward and beef up our supports of parts that we expect to see growing in importance in the future QRIS. So that's what the interim standards will do to help us bridge. Sure.
To clarify, so so there'll be a sort of a skinnying up of the existing system with some additional supports, but people will still be able to, programs will still be able to go through the process, get a rating, and move up the scale as this transition is happening.
Yes, as they do now, as they do today. Yep. It's like a sin to read slides, but I'm going to read this one because I think it's important, because it's the theory behind what a QRIS can be and the difference that it can make, and there's some important words in here, so I will actually commit the sin of reading a slide. The QRIS is, or can be, I guess, a mechanism to guide program leadership, to inform infrastructure development, and identify and provide supports needed to increase quality teaching and learning processes, and to engage and inform families about program quality. And the difference that can make is that early childhood and after school and out of school time learning environments, those that are led, structured and supported to enhance the kind of high-quality adult-child interactions that build learning, will result in higher quality programs and more positive outcomes for children. That's our expectation of what a QRS can do. And emphasized there are led, structured, and supported. So led by program administrators that are prepared to plan and support the growth of their programs, structured both in terms of their physical environment, their staffing, their plans for their days and their families' engagement, and supported both internally, programs leaders supporting their staff, programs supporting families, but also the state support of the programs that we license, subsidize, and rate. All that towards the goal of the QRS 2.0 is really, the change here is that in the past version, we had a goal for every level. There was a goal for level 1 and a goal for level 2. And really what we wanted to do is say, here's the overarching goal for the QRS, and every stage of the levels, which we're no longer going to call levels, the stage of development programs move for are building towards this broader goal. So this is the one goal of the QRS. It represents a vision that we are shooting for through the development of the QRS and the support of programs to engage with it. It represents what I think Joni referred to as the triad as well of curriculum, assessment, instruction. And so helping programs achieve high-quality teaching and learning environments so that what's taught by adults and learned by children is supported with developmentally appropriate practice. And as you'll see in the elements of this QRS, these practices are aligned to curriculum. They're utilizing and supported by screening and formative assessments, reinforced with families that are engaged, and implemented by staff that are engaged in meaningful process of continuous learning, planning, and implementation. Ultimately, so that our kids, our children, are developing and learning in relationships and environments that help them to achieve positive outcomes in school and life. It's our overarching goal that you should see developing through each stage of the QRS, shooting towards that goal. So building to that goal, we now have, yes, Joni, yes.
So you and I had this conversation too. The idea of an evidence-based curriculum is going to be a source of discussion, I know, but still the notion of standards that are actually guiding the choice of curriculum. I think we need to mention standards in here. Because that's what our curricula are based on, yeah?
Sure. What we want children to know, learn and know and do.
Know and be able to do, because I don't want
Right.
people to say, I have this box, I've
Exactly.
met that criteria
Yes,
without
exactly.
understanding behind it.
And we've
Yeah.
certainly had a lot of discussion about curriculum, and I'm sure we will today and Friday, but yes.
Thank you.
To that point. Alignment.
Right, right.
Yeah. Mhm.
And vertical and horizontal
Right.
within, once they get into different programs. Yeah.
Thank you. And across all program types, right. So building to this goal, we have now 4 stages of development that we expect programs will move through. The first stage, we envision programs are developing their plans to improve teaching and learning, so they are licensed. Their license is in good standing. They've completed all those newly required health and safety and orientation requirements, and they are developing their first continuous quality improvement plan to really take the time to reflect on where the strengths of our program, where are we building towards, what do we need to strengthen, where areas that we need supports, and that's really stage 1. And then stage 2, programs are initiating strategies to improve teaching and learning. So as you'll see, we're building from planning to really starting to test some of these out. Some of the key quality components of quality are in place. There's a curriculum, there's screening, instructional leadership, and meaningful family engagement. And the professional development, you'll see, will need to grow with the program, focusing on staff's understanding and use of these components. So at stage 3, we expect to see more integration of these strategies, and so that by stage 4, we can clearly see the programs are demonstrating high quality. I won't read you the slides, but as you can see, looking at the key components, which we'll talk about in the next slide, couple slides, as to looking really for the key components to be planned for, initiated, integrated, and then demonstrated as the program evolves in its quality growth over the life of the program. And those criteria that we'll look for are 6. So these become those 4 stages, and these 6 criteria really are the QRIS. So talking about streamlining and wanting to make it clear and understandable, you'll see different expectations of these 6 criteria as the program moves across the 4 stages of development, but basically the 6 criteria look to the learning environment and interactions, look to the curriculum and assessment, look to the use of screening, look to robust family engagement, and professional development, all based on a foundation of this continuous quality improvement process the programs will undergo as they build towards those 6 criteria, as they're planning, initiating, integrating, and demonstrating quality. And just a little bit more about that continuous quality improvement plan. As I said, there is one now, but we've developed a new CQIP, we call it, a toolkit, which has 3 components: a template that will help programs to move through sort of a strategic planning process where they're assessing needs, setting goals and action steps, implementing a plan, reflecting on progress, and refining their goals across the elements of the QRS. So at each stage of development of the program's quality, programs will go back and redo this process of assessing, planning, and evaluating their progress. There's a manual that helps programs think about how to do that, and a handbook of activities and resources to help programs think about what resources are out there in the world and can be provided by EEC as well. So the new QRS will require support around this continuous quality improvement plan and helping programs to go through that process of evaluation and planning. And this tool will be measured as part of our QRIS. So we'll have a template that we will use, we call it a rubric, to measure programs, what we expect programs to have in their continuous quality improvement plan at each stage of the QRIS. So that's just important to spend some time thinking that this will be foundational. Some other changes that have happened since we brought the QRIS to you in June 2017. Things that have happened since then as we've been challenged and encouraged to make this the best QRIS that we can be. We've moved from a broad goal of improving program quality to a much more focused goal of improving teaching and learning and supporting positive youth development and after-school, out-of-school time programs. We have this growth-oriented stage for each for each stage of the QRIS, drawn from the principles of Bloom's taxonomy, so expecting to see growth over the stage of development. The requirement of the ages and stages questionnaire as the developmental screener, we're explicitly calling out that tool in alignment with the early literacy expert panel findings and our understanding that is most commonly used screener in the state, and many programs are already familiar with it, and its helpfulness in terms of family engagement and understanding of child growth and development. Introduction of a formative assessment system at stage 3. It was in level 2. Removal of the PASS and BASS business planning. I think it's important to remember here that our licensing requirements do require that programs are soundly administered. Group and school age programs must submit a budget at licensing and license renewal, and any programs receiving our subsidies are subject to audit. Not that many would receive an audit, but they are subject to potentially being audited as part of our subsidy system. And we do plan to build in here a focus on the business side on our professional development supports. So to really shift from having a tool that programs have to submit and get scored on to really focusing on the leadership and the planning and our professional development around the business supports that programs need to have to be successful is the shift that's taken place here. Much closer tie of family engagement criteria to the QRS. We're excited about that. The inclusion of infrastructure for professional development as an element of quality. We talked at the board retreat about how we're tackling that as looking at the infrastructure in the programs as part of the QRS and the professional development as part of their professional development plans that would be reflected in their CQIP. Greater emphasis on the CQIP. Earlier technical assistance and coaching expectations. We expect to provide supports earlier on than we've done in the past. I'd actually like to emphasize that I think that the amount of support and technical assistance that will be needed at stages 1 and 2 of the QRS are going to be significant, where at stages 3 and 4, if we're providing some intensive coaching to the relatively small number of programs that achieve level 3 and 4, I think that's fantastic, and we should do that, and we're thinking about that through the public-private partnership that we've been discussing. But that really a huge emphasis of our work and our alignment of our supports are going to be around those first couple stages of the QRS and preparing them to move into stage 3 and on into 4. So just to frame that a little bit for you. We have reduced from 5 levels to 4 stages, and we've changed our terminology, Mary Wallachy, no more levels, she challenged us earlier, to 1-star, 2-star. So we're calling them stages now, but eventually when we roll this out, you'll be a 1-star program, 2-star program as a way to show the gradation, and that's some communication work that we've done. So I'm going to hand it to Amy to walk you through the 4 growth-oriented stages of the QRIS and what our verification process will look like.
Great. And so I'll start with the early childhood QRIS, and then we'll later move into the after school at a school time QRIS because they're a little bit different. So looking at these 4 growth-oriented stages of the early childhood QRIS, stage 1 remains very similar to how you've seen it consistently since the first time we began to discuss changes to the QRIS. We're still considering the EEC license or license exemption as the base for QRIS. Across those 3 program types, family, child care, public preschool, community center-based programs. But what we're looking to do with the inclusion of the continuous quality improvement plan there is to begin to establish a new way for programs to really think and reflect about program quality, considering perhaps the most recent licensing study, perhaps other data that they have about their program, and to begin right there with the continuous quality improvement plan. There is a template being developed specifically for the 1-star CQIP. So that is that's a consistency you'll see here in this presentation as well. Where it changes a little bit is as we move into stage 2, where we begin to initiate strategies to improve teaching and learning, as evidenced by the use of a developmentally appropriate evidence-based curriculum. And you're right, that's a new term for us to be thinking about with regard to the QRIS in Massachusetts. We've been talking about evidence-based curriculum being developmentally appropriate, and the way in which we're planning to do that is to support with a specific list of acceptable evidence-based curriculum for use in early childhood ed programs. The use of the ASQ, as Anita pointed out, specifically as the developmental screener that we're looking for inclusion within the QRIS. We want to emphasize as well here at stage 2 the inclusion of referrals and the identification and patterns and data across the program with the use of the ASQ. You'll see this continue to be focused on in all of the different stages, but including here initiating strategies around the learning environment and interactions that foster learning, exploration, and play. And then as far as family engagement is concerned, really developing deep knowledge about individual children and their families at this particular stage. In addition, another one of the points that will carry forward is the planning for ongoing professional development of educators and administrators. That begins to establish that infrastructure of PD, as Anita had discussed a little bit earlier. And again, continuing to focus on this process of continuous quality improvement with the implementation of a 2-star CQIP. Talk about verification and the way that this would be supported as well in a moment.
Yeah, can I ask a question? I'm curious as to what the feedback has been from any public schools, if you've had any yet, about the use of ASQs as the screener.
Yeah.
Just because of that whole requirement for special ed screening.
Right. I think that's going to be one of those areas that we need to continue to explore to be sure that isn't a structural barrier for our public schools. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But there is a kindergarten screening mandate.
There sure is.
Without guidance around the tool so far.
We have that for kids entering kindergarten by October of their kindergarten year.
Yeah.
But we also have that old child find piece
Right.
for 3- and 4-year-old kids to be screened and or assessed depending on need. So, you know, I bring it up continuously just because it kind of confuses. It could confuse the public school aspect of it.
Yeah, I appreciate your bringing it up. That is one of those things that we had flagged as a potential, one of those things that we're going to want to keep exploring, particularly with our public preschool partners.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Okay. Moving on to stage 3. So this is where you begin to introduce the integration of strategies. So thinking here about a system of formative assessment that's aligned with the program's evidence-based curriculum. We want to ensure that that formative assessment system does match the curriculum that the program has chosen, and that there's some adaptation of the curriculum through the use of that formative assessment data that the program's collecting here at stage 3, particularly when we're thinking about differentiating for children in the program. Again, implementing learning environments and interactions, continuing around family engagement strategies that follow up on the screening-based referrals and that really help connect what's happening at the program in terms of curriculum and activities, all of the learning really, to what's happening at home, and ensuring that there's some reciprocity there too, that home is also affecting and being reflected in curriculum. In addition, enhancing the infrastructure for professional development supports, and then engaging in that 3-star continuous quality improvement plan and implementing that. And then as we move up to stage 4, this is where it all does come together, demonstrating strategies that improve teaching and learning in our early ed programs by using that developmental screening and formative assessment data to identify individual learning goals for children. This is that stage where you're really beginning to think about each child and their specific needs in the program, and then using all of the data that you have at your disposal to really inform the curriculum toward those individual goals. Again, continuing around the learning environment and interactions, making sure that that's an integral piece. And as you see from the maps, there's ways in which the learning environment and interactions affect all the other elements of quality as well. Engaging in these robust family engagement strategies here at stage 4 that strengthen the family's capacity to support child development. And this could also include family leadership in the program and the incorporation of home visits. And then moving on to an advanced infrastructure. So really seeing the program supporting individual educators and administrators' career pathways here through demonstration of specific program level practices that are laid out for you in your maps, and including the 4-star continuous quality improvement plan.
Just clarify, when Amy refers to maps, these are the attachments we sent you for each program type. We just give you more detail. So.
Right. Speaking of reading through slides, right?
Question?
No such thing, Mary.
The difference between stage 4 and 4-star CQIP, are we talking about this?
It's the
so
same.
are we going to be referring to organizations or programs as in stage 4 or 4-star, or I'm a little confused there.
So the branding really does kind of speak to the star level. So a program could be a 1-star program, a 2-star program, but then there are these 4 stages of the QRIS that are aligned with those star levels. So the stars that are on that slide or on the overhead slide, they do represent those 4 different levels of the QRIS that will be referred to by stars.
And it's when you've achieved that stage, right? So you can be working
down the road.
Yes.
We're cooking with gas here.
Yeah.
Yep.
I'm wanting to see if my site where my child is
Star,
has
as a
4
4-star,
stars.
right. Yeah, as a
Okay.
parent, I think
That's
that will
right.
be most clear to, but it also reflects that programs are moving through these stages. So you may
Right.
not have achieved 4 stars.
Right.
You could be in your 3rd stage working towards, or even working on a lot of those stage 4 elements, but not until you've achieved them and been verified.
But that's
Are you
more
a
an
4-star?
internal sort
Exactly.
of conversation
Yep.
as opposed
Exactly.
to external.
External.
Okay.
Externally,
Star.
yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
So it's hard to understand, based on the information we have currently, about the nature of the verification and potential cut scores affiliated with these levels. I know we're going to get into that, but I didn't see a lot of detail. So big picture, can you please help me understand, where is it that you're expecting a sort of sufficient level of quality to drive outcomes to occur? We had started to see it at level 3. Are we now shifting that to level 4? It's a little tough to tell. What is your intention behind these?
Yeah. If you're thinking about the cut scores, we're expecting to include those at stage 3, so at a 3-star program.
Meaning, like, cut scores that mean you're likely producing improved child outcomes, or cut scores that mean you're somewhere on a positive pathway in that general direction?
I would expect the cut scores to be relatively similar to, if not identical to, the current way in which we structure our cut scores for levels 3 and 4 in the current QRIS. So you can certainly point to some improved child outcomes associated with the current level 3, which I would expect you'd be able to see continued into the future, 3-star or stage 3 program. We have not yet landed on those exact cut scores. We're still taking a look at some of the diverse programs and the ways in which those programs may need to be represented. So,
That's
yeah.
helpful. And I would encourage as early as possible.
Okay,
Yes.
inclusion of cut scores.
Yes,
Okay.
absolutely.
All right, so
Laying
Yes.
foundation with a curriculum at 2 actually,
Right.
hopefully, should accelerate that in comparison to the last system, right?
Yes.
But I agree with you.
Lots of questions related to that too. Yes.
Right.
Okay, so moving on into the verification for early childhood ed programs. So the things that we're looking to do here are to adopt some verification tools and processes to meet these particular needs. These are the required elements that we have regarding our verification process. So we expect that all of these tools and processes will have inclusion and cultural and linguistic considerations evident throughout. That they'll be concrete and observable and measurable. We want them to be able to demonstrate as well a clear path to higher quality, to distinguish between these inputs and outputs and outcomes, and then to use wherever we can evidence-based tools to align with positive child outcomes, as we were just discussing about some of those. There's some language in here too, which you can see about the portfolio system and the way we are expecting to adopt a portfolio, which is a new addition to the QRIS 2.0, allowing programs greater flexibility to demonstrate that they're meeting the requirements of the QRIS. Selecting measures that are reflective of their specific programming, for example, and that they'll be expected to compile those portfolios, we expect online, and to be able to upload documents in that way. So sometimes people think that word portfolio and they kind of automatically jump to that binder on the shelf that would be then used as evidence. But that is, we talk about portfolio, we're thinking about it more as a way for programs to have greater flexibility in meeting the requirements of the QRIS 2.0. And I wanted to make a point too that with regard to the verification of some of these process-oriented criteria, of which there are many in the QRIS 2.0, we're looking to examine practices on a common rubric, examining from a continuum about emerging practice to established practice. So applying one common framework in terms of a rubric to, say, for example, a program's use of curriculum, or a program's processes for family engagement that are tied to, promoting that connection between home and the program. So hopefully that helps clarify.
Yes,
I
Joan.
think certainly having a rubric is a good overlay here. How do you anticipate operationalizing that, particularly in the context of a portfolio that might be viewed from a distance online?
Sure. We are looking to some of the other states who have begun some of this sort of process-oriented oversight of their QRISs for some leadership around this. And there are lots of different ways that states are doing that. Sometimes there's a second reader and there's some agreement on a particular score depending on that rubric. Sometimes there's, every so often there's a second reader. So we haven't developed the policies for the way in which we would implement that rubric, but the rubric itself is in development right now.
But concretely, Joan, to have in that rubric very specifically what we'd be looking for within a portfolio. So to say, you submit your portfolio, you can show things differently, but what we need to see are these specific things, and being very clear with programs about what we'll be looking for.
Thank you.
Okay. Do you mind advancing?
Oh, sorry.
Thanks.
And to your earlier point, Joan, I also want to just reflect also to say that this QRIS will need at some point, like we did with the prior verification process, to look for, we'll need to continue our commitment to researching our outcomes, like what outcomes does this new QRIS have? So that would require a validation study of this QRS, and hopefully we would look beyond center-based. In the prior we looked at center-based only. I'd be really curious to look at the impacts on family child care out of school time. Yeah, so we need to keep that in mind as well. Keep evaluating ourselves. So to the verification tools.
Sure. So this slide really goes through the different verification tools that we'll be using in the QRIS 2.0 and the process for their use. Starting with the license or the license status and confirmation of that by EEC staff through IT, and right now LEAD is our primary system for looking at licensing. Using the environment rating scales, and this is across all program types, including after school, out of school time, the observation, use, and scoring by reliable raters, following program training and technical assistance. You'll see that same sort of a structure emerge as well as you kind of move down this list. Use of the class within center-based and public preschool programs, again, with a reliable rater and following program training and technical assistance on the class. For after school, out of school time programs, the use of either the APT or the school age PQA, both of which are tools that can be used around continuous quality improvement in after school, out of school time. And I want to just make a quick note about the reasons why we've kind of landed on this dual tool recommendation for after school, out of school time programs. It came through a recommendation from the after school, out of school time working group that was convened a year ago, June, that said that because both of these tools have similar goals of continuous quality improvement within OST programs, some programs have the APT already well established in their program, others have the PQA well established within theirs. But because they're both continuous quality improvement tools, allowing for that flexibility really makes the levels or the stages 3 and 4 that much more achievable for programs by allowing that differentiation. There will be some documentation collected through the QRIS 2.0, although we've taken great pains to reduce that and to really think about those documents that would be really most applicable to demonstrated program quality. We do expect that to be submitted and collected electronically and verified by EEC staff using that common rubric. Portfolios, we've already discussed that as well, and then continuous quality improvement plans, which Anita spoke to earlier, and the way in which we expect those to be used as a much more key piece in the QRIS 2.0. And so, kind of calling back to our earlier conversation that for all of these things that we're asking of programs, we want to be considering the supports as well. There are certain supports that we need to be thinking about when we move through the stages of the QRIS 2.0, including right at stage 1, increased licensing supports. And so we have a new orientation and new health and safety trainings that will be rolling out shortly for the mixed delivery system related to those topics. We expect to develop voluntary trainings on those topics at the stage 1 that you'll be planning for stage 2 as you move forward, which include developmental screening, selection of curriculum, the environment rating scales, and continuous quality improvement development, as well as just an overall QRIS overview. We haven't had that for quite some time because we haven't had a brand new QRIS. So including that as a voluntary training, allowing programs to really select those things that they feel are most applicable, and that then as well technical assistance providers can refer to as supports for programs as they're engaged in the QRIS. And we want to be sure too that we've got EEC staff to review and provide feedback on the CQIP at stage 1. As programs move on to stage 2, again, voluntary training on formative assessment in class, which they'll see come up at stage 3. So setting that expectation that there's going to be those new elements introduced and being sure to support them. There's a technical assistance visit at stage 2 with use of the environment rating scales tool, again across all program types, with EEC staff reviewing and providing feedback to the program on those elements that you see. At stage 3, there's also an environment rating scales reliable rater observation and scoring, and technical assistance on the use of the class for instructional leaders. So you can see that at that stage 3, you're teeing up again for what's to come at stage 4.
And the score comes into play at stage 3 on the environment rating scale.
Back to the cut score conversation.
Cut scores at level 3 for environment rating scale, and cut scores for stage 4 on the class.
Mm-hmm. And then you continue to see EE staff reviewing and providing feedback on the different elements of quality that come into play at those different stages. All right. And so for folks who prefer kind of an overview of the system, just in its most bare bones kind of high view, this is, I think, a nice slide that really talks about the ways in which these tools come into play at different stages in the QRIS 2.0. It speaks about the elements of quality and the criteria down that left-hand side, and then the tools needed for the different stages across the top. And so you can easily track down the license is a primary tool at stage 1, and then the continuous quality improvement plan comes into play there. So this would be used for technical assistance for programs, as well as just to give a little bit more of an overview about the way in which the QRIS 2.0 is structured.
Yeah, Joan.
So I know that there's still a lot more sort of thinking and development that goes into all of this, but I'm wondering if you could speak at this early stage about the extent to which you envision using some of our existing infrastructure and programs, both within EEC and beyond, to deliver on these, and to what extent you envision needing additional staff or sort of structures to enable what you're describing here.
Sure. I want to flip back, I won't, but just for my own mind, flip back to the alignment of support slide. For example, Joan and I spoke, for example, family child care systems exist across the state. We have some 45, 49 of
42.
them. 42. I can envision really working with those entities to, if we can provide training to them and have them function much more in a coaching way towards supporting the family child care educators in their programs to understand the QRIS, to help with continuous quality improvement, and to provide the training that they offer. Systems offer training to educators and home visits to family child care educators aligned with the QRIS. I can see huge benefit for having the QRIS as the guideline for that growth, development, and relationship with systems. So it would be exactly like that, thinking about what infrastructure do we have now, and how can we align it to the elements of the new QRIS. So another example would be our EPS grant right now is where coaching lives, and it's very much technical assistance type coaching right now, which I would envision at the stage 1 and 2 phases of QRIS development. So really aligning those coaches, training those existing coaches that are out there today, to understand and support the continuous quality improvement plans, the professional development required, understanding the curriculum and assessment expectations that are coming in the new QRIS, and aligning again that existing resource to supporting the QRIS. Same thing with early childhood mental health consultation. That's a grant that's been around for years. It's increased in the last year, and it's another form of coaching, really helping programs think about how, leadership of the program, thinking about how are you supporting children in the structure of your program, supporting children's behavioral health and children that are facing any challenges. So that's another grant that we can align intentionally to support the objectives of the QRIS and the growth of programs as defined by quality here. Coming forward, clearly we're going to need the IT. We have LEAD, we have the CCFA. We're in the process of procuring the learning management system, which will enable us to not just offer online training, because online training isn't the answer for everything, but it's a resource, but to also help us track who's getting what training and what training is needed, and how does that align with what we're seeing as needs across the program quality continuum. And the new funds coming, I think we can think very intentionally about what we're calling the Career Pathways Grant, our partnership with community colleges. How can what they're offering be aligned with this in terms of what programs need, from the leadership to the classroom to the family child care or after school, out of school time program. So it's really just, hopefully we land on this in October and can really use this to guide all of those decisions about what are we buying, how can we align across licensing and subsidy and workforce development, and what we purchase through contracts and what we support through grants in alignment with this work.
I was going to say, too, I think we're really going to have to support the field in the development of a really healthy growth mindset. You know, it's just a little bit of new perspective on all of this that's going to have to be supported.
I just add, I think Anita has spoken very well to the existing structures that we have and the alignment opportunities that they represent, but I just want to note, I was intentional in including an update, or at least providing knowledge to the board about this business redesign effort that we have underway, because I see that as, while development of a QRIS is not an explicit requirement of CCDBG, program quality goals certainly are embedded within CCDBG, and I think the gap analysis work that we're going to undertake would be inclusive of looking at our systems and what even within our better aligned system, might still be present by way of deficits, in order to support this. So I expect that, some of the recommendations that would be coming out of that would be inclusive of efforts to support our program quality work, beyond just simple compliance with CCDBG. So that, again, as I mentioned, would yield to considerations for some of the new CCDBG funding, perhaps, which I think, we're going to want to think about in the context of enhancing current systems or building even to space that currently is not occupied by some of the pieces that we have. There's going to be gaps that we're going to need to get to. I mean, simply, citing to the license here, that in and of itself is an area of deficit. I mean, we have, caseload ratios right now that I think, we need to acknowledge. And as we think about how we would, I think necessarily integrate our program quality work into our licensing work, that's an area that we're going to need to look to. So I would just consider that to be, part of the necessary assessment and focus on integration that I wanted to call out earlier. So I would supplement Anita's response by simply saying that this is also going to rely on, that further assessment and those recommendations. And we do have those federal resources. It's also a reason for us to not rush too quickly forward in applying those resources until we've, I think, figured out where within our current commitments that we're making, we're going to need to apply those funds in order to make this meaningful and workable.
We'll take a few moments just to talk about how this is different for after-school and out-of-school time programming.
And I will just highlight those areas in which it's pretty different. Still, we're looking at 4 stages of the QRIS, so there will still be 4 STAR programs through the after-school, out-of-school time QRIS. Just a word about this particular program type 2 is that the way in which we've designed the QRIS is to meet the needs of diverse programs within the after-school, out-of-school time field. Stage 1 is very, very similar to the way in which we're conceiving of stage 1 in early childhood ed. Stage 2 is where you start to get a little bit of the differentiation between the program types, however. So the overall goal for after school, out of school times is to support positive youth development. And so all of the stages in the QRIS for after school, out of school time are really to that particular end, improving positive youth development and supporting positive youth development. Stage 2, you see the encouragement of youth voice and choice in program planning and activity selection as one of the things that's fundamentally different about this particular program type in QRIS from the early childhood ed. And then there's a different way in terms of thinking about the schools that children are coming from when they're attending the after school, out of school time program, and really identifying that in addition to developing knowledge about individual children and their families. At stage 3, you see a little bit of difference as well in terms of planning and implementing activities that promote youth development skills and the identification of children's youth development skills through observation. You'll note that the elements are very similar in terms of, an observation component. You see that present in both the after school, out of school time and the early ed, but the way in which it comes out is different here in after school, out of school time. And working with families and schools to promote positive youth development too, and really thinking about the school as a partner in this work. By the time you're hitting stage 4, you want to see the same sort of integration we were talking about at stage 4 in early childhood ed programs, where you're really thinking about each individual child in the program and individualizing for that child. So planning and implementing activities that promote each child's youth development skills. Thinking about all that you know about that child, about their family, about their school, the observations that you've done within your program, and thinking specifically about those individual children within the context of your program, and then involving communities as well here, so family, school, and community engagement, and thinking about ways in which those 3 elements work together to support positive youth development. The verification here is very similar, and we've touched on it already. So as you begin to think about, again, the criteria down the left, the stages across the top, and the tools that are being used,
in the verification of after-school and out-of-school time programs. We're still thinking about the inclusion of the SACers here, but the way in which the SACer scores would be applied would potentially be very different depending on the use of dedicated or shared space by the program, and then as well the scope of the program, whether it has a broad focus or a very narrow focus on a particular set of activities. An example might be a Taekwondo program, for example. And then the ways in which the APT or the school age PQA could be incorporated here around building those positive youth development skills through the curriculum and activities is a little bit different as well. Yes?
Can I ask you a question about the prior page?
Sure thing.
I'm sorry, the stages.
Sure.
Intentionally, did you not, or am I missing it, have any mention of curriculum or standards? Anything? The only thing I see is, as assessment is observation.
Right. If you look to the after school, out of school time overview that came with it, you'll see more of the language around activities and curriculum. Activities was chosen specifically for those stage 2 programs that really may not have curriculum per se, but to represent that kind of idea of the content of what's happening within the scope of the program, whether it is a community boating program, whether it is a YWCA or a YMCA type program, and then the inclusion of that word curriculum around stage 3.
So I'll just say the same thing.
Yeah.
Standards.
Yeah, standards
Because
for
even if
curriculum
it's a
too.
Taekwondo program,
Right.
we're still working on, health and wellness.
Right.
So what are those standards that are getting into those activities, that are informing those activities?
Okay, thank you.
We heard from our friends from the Ys this afternoon.
Felt like this morning.
Are we sensing that we're not fully addressing? Can you just speak to where you think we're
Sure.
at in relationship to the testimony that we heard?
Yes, we've certainly met with the Ys for some time, and licensing covers a lot of physical activity requirements, and as do the environment rating scales, so that we feel like much of what they're looking for is embedded in those tools, and it's also additional guidance that we can provide to programs as they look to implement and move their programs through quality. So that's the way that we've been thinking about addressing their concerns, rather than creating a specific criteria around physical activity and nutrition as a separate criteria. We see it embedded.
So just to follow up, so they're coming today and expressing their, I don't know what word to use, concern, suggests that they're not in agreement with you about that sort of answer, or are they?
YMCA's they could repeatedly come to the board, right, and would like an explicit criteria within. We, as an agency, are not recommending for an explicit criteria, not the least of which is verification of that would be an extremely difficult thing to achieve. We've said from the beginning that we think that it's better addressed through guidance, and we've communicated that to the YMCA's as well. And we're committed to that as part of our guidance process, but we're not at this point recommending an explicit criteria inclusion.
So I can kind of understand not an explicit criteria, but maybe whether it's in guidance or written as part of this, could, when you define what an evidence-based curriculum is, could there be mention of that we're covering all child development domains, which include all this, so that we're getting that piece of it in writing here?
Certainly consider that. The challenge is trying to sort of meet everything for everybody, and create a streamlined system. So,
The only other way to think about it, but they were recommending level or stage star 4.
Yeah,
So we
that's
should,
new to me.
we can talk about this again on Friday, and workforce
Definitely.
maybe spend a little more time on this question, but the other consideration is just where it fits maybe with the CQIP. In other words, is it a growth area? Is it something we should be striving to do more of?
Certainly not
But
anything we disagree with. No, we certainly agree with
Yeah, in fact, I
yeah.
wouldn't want to see it only, I mean, in some ways, we can talk more about this, but it wouldn't be just at stage 4. In a way, it's very foundational, right? It's sort of
Exactly.
how you design the program, therefore it's in the licensing and the the observational tools we've got, so we have to think a little more about it.
Yeah, there should be nothing in stage 4 that's not being built to through stages 1 through 3. So it would need to be being built to through all the stages, so we can certainly.
Likely that many of the curricula would have an explicit nutrition and, well, potentially a unit of study, for example, but, no.
Well, certainly in early childhood curriculum, absolutely you'd see it. In out of school time, I think if we just go on a standard, we'd see it there.
We can certainly circle back to it on Friday. That's good.
Other?
No? Oops, sorry, I went past my own slide. So, okay, so to wrap up, where we go from here, we have some phases of our own to move this forward. We'd like to set this new definition of quality by bringing this back to you after our meeting on Friday, and if we need another discussion between October 9, I'd certainly be happy to set that up. But bring it to you in October so that hopefully you feel confident that this is our direction and we vote on it. We will then continue on in the creation of the interim changes that we would like to have out for the field by December, by the end of this calendar year. That the skinny set, as the secretary referred to them. We need some broad communication about the interim and the future QRS. We don't want any, excuse me, miscommunication that the field thinks that because, should you vote in October, that the new QRS is suddenly in play. We'll really need to communicate to the field that the current QRS is in play with some interim changes as they emerge, and that they should continue with the current QRS. So we'll have to really be sure to communicate about that until QRS 2.0 hits the field. Our new FY19 grants that are being drafted now, we need to align them to the new QRS definition, and the CQIP toolkit, which is currently under development, we need to adapt for the different program types. So that's between now and December. January to June, we need to develop the infrastructure moving forward, which would be as we write our FY20 grants, which we do in the spring for next year, we'd align those to the QRS. We have a lot of work to do to develop a point system. We can revisit this if you like, but we've talked about having a hybrid model where there are blocks. You achieve level 1, stage 1 and 2 before you move on to 3 and 4, and we envision in the higher stages a point system that we have yet to develop, which would be based on scores and measurements of portfolios and documentation. Glossary, guidance for the field, policies for the implementation, and a staffing plan around the implementation of the QRS. We currently have training on ASQ. The environmental rating scales in the class are currently being offered, but making sure that we're very intentional that those are being offered in alignment with these new QRS criteria. And our program quality manager development should begin during that time period, pending approval of the funds in the FY19 spending plan. And then phase 3 is our launch phase, and the timing will of course depend on the budget and resources available, but as we envision it, we have our staff in place, we have a program quality management system that's being tested and rolled out, ongoing development of coaching and technical assistance systems, and ongoing alignment of our grant funds or any funds with the QRS quality definition and need supports. So we really look to, as Joan referred to it in one conversation I had with her, making QRS the backbone in terms of the definition of supports and quality, our definition of quality and the alignment of our supports to that quality going forward. So that's our charge. Any final thoughts, guidance, challenges, things to think about before we come back to you next in October?
No one else will say it.
Say it, ma'am.
I think we have to acknowledge how much work this has been and how it's been a long process, and we're not quite there, but applaud the hard work and the thought and the leadership to get us where we are today.
Thank you.
So thank you.
Thank you.
And I would add that it does feel like it's getting a lot more concrete and grounded with some really sort of, I think, much more clear next steps and some thinking about sort of some of the pragmatics around it. So I'm really encouraged, and thank you.
Thank you, Joe.
I'll just add more thanks for the work that's been done, because I do think it's skinnier using this term.
Skinnying up.
In a good way. But more focused and clearer ways to distinguish one level from the next, and I think it represents a logical and a pragmatic progression of practice from 1 to 4 stars or stages. Anyway, I think just overall, I come away feeling, especially compared to the existing system, that it is, and I think we heard this from the field as well a little bit today, that it is going to be more clear to them what they're supposed to do. It's going to be more productive for them in terms of being able to implement things in a coherent way over time. And I think ultimately is going to lead to better outcomes for kids. And some of that is knocking on wood, but hopefully, as you said, as we start to dig a little deeper into understanding the impact of these quality standards on child outcomes, that we're going to see positive results. So I'm very, very grateful for the work. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary. Thank you, really. Thank you all.
Really great. Look forward to debriefing Friday, and we'll aim to wrap this up in October. Thank you both. Thank you so much. Yeah. Well, that's a wrap. Carolyn, welcome again.
Thank you.
See you all in a month, but probably before that, many of you. Thanks.